Welcome, wrestling fans, to the Pro Wrestle Machine. Let's jump right into it. April 16, 2001 Wrestling Observer Newsletter. WrestleMania 17 Shatters Records. By Dave Meltzer. Wrestling Observer Newsletter. While there are no final figures in, there is little doubt that WrestleMania 17 from April 1st at the Reliant Astrodome in Houston was the biggest revenue-producing event in the history of pro wrestling. At press time there was no estimate regarding pay-per-view internally sent out within Titan Sports, but the earliest company projections show a major increase over last year's record-breaking 824,000 buys. The latest projections by the company were in the neighborhood of a 2.4% buy rate and 1 million total buys, which cable industry sources indicate a similar range. From a buy rate standpoint, it would be the best buy rate a pro wrestling pay-per-view show has done in the US since SummerSlam of 1991, at a time when pay-per-view was still in its infancy. Fewer homes were hooked up, and buy rates across the board were far larger. If those numbers were to hold up, the total pay-per-view gross for the event would be in the range of $40 million, $39.95 list price, and with the like gate and merchandise it would put the total take for the event, not including international television rights, at $44.6 million, destroying the record of $31.32 million set at last year's Mania. WWFE's portion of that revenue would be significantly lower, but WWFE's final take on pay-per-view should be in the neighborhood of $16.8 million. There was some confusion at the settlement for WrestleMania as it regarded the paid attendance. The gate was for the show was $3,530,905, but the paid attendance was 61,079. The total attendance, with 6,846 comps, was the 67,925 that was hyped heavily on television. From a paid standpoint, the difference means the show was the fourth largest paid attendance in the history of pro wrestling in North America, and not the second. It was the second largest as it pertains to actual crowd. It trails both the Hulk Hogan vs. Ultimate Warrior Toronto Sky Dome WrestleMania 1990 figure, 61,864, and the Hogan vs. Paul Orndorff Toronto Exhibition Stadium 1986 figure, 61,470, when it comes to paid attendance. The difference in paid attendance also changes the per cap merchandise figure, which is based on paid attendance as opposed to total number in the building. Don't ask me why, that's just how it's done, to $18.20 per head, which is still the second highest total for pro wrestling in North America, trailing only last year's Mania in Anaheim. The overall merchandising figure for Mania was a North American record, but it may not have been an all-time WWF record as we were unable at press time to get exact merchandising figures for the August 28, 1992 SummerSlam event at Wembley Stadium, which was thought to have been the biggest one-day merchandising event in company history, and the Wembley show drew more fans live than Mania. WrestleMania set the all-time pay-per-view record for Australia for any event with 32,000 buys. A very strange, and not necessarily in a good way, show, built around the concept of New Japan against its founder and first star, Antonio Inoki, drew the smallest dome show crowd in the history of the promotion on April 9th. The crowd was announced at 27,000 in the 45,000-seat Osaka Dome that was almost sold out on New Year's Eve for Inoki's pro wrestling show. The real number was closer to 20,000 and it may have been less than that, but it would still be a gate in excess of $2 million. Ringside wasn't even full and the upper deck was closed off. The previous dome low for New Japan was 25,000 on May 5, 2000 at the Fukuoka Dome for a double main of Kensuke Sasaki vs. Great Muta for the IWGP Heavyweight title and Yuji Nagata and Manabu Nakanishi vs. Naoya Ogawa and Kazunari Murakami for the tag team titles. For the first time ever on a New Japan Dome show, the crowd looked bad on television. The number was excused after the fact by some as because of it being on a non-holiday Monday night, unlike the usual holidays when New Japan holds its major shows, so fans from outside of Osaka couldn't get off work in time to travel into the city. But the reality is they booked a show that people didn't want to pay to see and the company is going downward because it is being torn in so many different directions at once. New Japan seems to have given up on its own style, based around in-ring work and constantly pushing the rise of younger wrestlers against established veterans, and is trying to instead copy the only two styles of wrestling working to a major degree right now, the WWF style and the Pride style. The problem is that you simply can't do both styles, as they are complete opposites, and both styles take away from the match quality, which has been New Japan's strong point for most of the past 2 decades. The live crowd had to be disappointed by what amounted to a glorified American-style television taping headlined by work-shoot-style matches, shooting angles that will apparently build for the May 5th Fukuoka Dome show, a show coming entirely too quickly, and rushed matches due to being on live television. The hardcore fans didn't like the show due to the match quality. The show itself, as the company's only live primetime network television special, airing from 8 to 9:55 p.m. on TV Asahi, meaning it would be the largest audience of the year to watch pro wrestling in Japan, and perhaps anywhere in the world for that matter, was used more to shoot angles before a large as possible audience. The show drew a 10.7 rating, about 15 million viewers, peaking at 16.1, 23 million viewers, for the six-man tag match at 9 p.m., which means that match because of Muto and Chono had the most mainstream interest, even more than Norton versus Fujita, even with Inoki at ringside doing commentary. The number was decent, although some, including those at TV Asahi, not realizing the circumstances that went into last year's much higher rating, were disappointed, and it may not be easy to get another prime-time special. Given the lineup, they shouldn't have been. The real negatives from a television side, and then in shortening the matches and concentrating on the angles, TV Asahi took commercial breaks at the start of the matches, which infuriated enough fans that the network switchboard was lit up like a Christmas tree, particularly when the first television match, a grudge match between Jushin Liger and Murakami, was already over with a DQ finish. DQ finishes never go over well in Japan, but somehow New Japan never learns and feels it has to do them on big shows, and no replay was shown since they were already into the big angle of the show when the commercial break was over. To make things worse, for the next match, with the first ever Riki Choshu versus Toshiaki Kawada meeting, when the bout started, again they went to a commercial. This was blamed on a lack of communication between the TV Asahi production crew and New Japan, as they didn't realize the first match would be going less than 2 minutes. Several sources all felt this frustrated viewers enough that casual fans would switch to other programming and that the rating would also be a disappointment, but with the rating peaking later, that wasn't the case. The reality is that last year's rating was drawn by Shinya Hashimoto putting up his career against Ogawa after a series of matches that in their own way will become legendary. It was super drama that clicked, as evidenced by that match drawing a 24.0 quarter and 15.7 for the show overall. That number is not a fair comparison in the first place, as it wasn't New Japan Wrestling last year that drew the number, but the right angle that got over to the mainstream with two really over personalities. This year's show, even if the matches had been great and there were no production snafus, had no storylines remotely garnering that kind of interest. The positive is that the angles themselves got a lot of heat and there was nothing that would be considered bad on the show, although some of the matches for various reasons were disappointing. 1. Takashi Iizuka, Takayuki Iizuka, beat Minoru Tanaka in 9:37 with a choke. Said to be a very good opener, and one of the two best matches on the card, which should be no surprise. However, it was also the junior heavyweight champion losing to a mid-level heavyweight in the opener of the show. Which wouldn't be bad, except that was the same theme for all three non-TV matches. 2. Yutaka Yoshi beat Shinya Makabe via submission in 8:59 with the old Bruno Sammartino backbreaker over the shoulder. Yoshi is the much larger of the two, again, a mid-level heavyweight beating the company's rising junior heavyweight star who is a much better worker with more potential. 3. Brian Johnston beat Kendo Kashin Tokumitsu Ishizawa in 2:20 with a guillotine choke. Basically a rushed squash match since they needed it over before television started. Kashin is dead, and a rematch with Ryan Gracie next month will only make things worse. Johnston has been talked with about going into Pride, so they want to make him a strong pro wrestling representative. Johnston came from UFC into New Japan a few years ago along with friend and training partner Don Fry. 4. Jushin Liger, Keiichi Yamada, beat Kazunari Murakami via DQ in 1:47. After shooting such a hot angle on television for this was the payoff. Can you imagine when the match started they went to a commercial, and when they came back, they were doing run-ins and mic work, and didn't even explain or show what happened? Murakami came out with both Naoya Ogawa and Akira Shoji in his corner. Liger had a new outfit with no top, showing his blown-up physique, and he wore a smaller mask. The finish saw Ogawa interfering for the DQ to set up the big angle of the show, which they wanted right away. Liger, whose mask was ripped off by Murakami, went after Murakami while New Japan younger wrestlers tried to cover his face with a towel in the old protect his identity gimmick. Ogawa then went to the announcer's desk where Tatsumi Fujinami was doing color and they started arguing. Fujinami attacked Ogawa before wrestlers broke them up. At this point, Riki Choshu's music played since he was in the next match and the place went nuts. Everyone was still brawling in the ring as wrestlers tried to keep Liger and Murakami away from each other. Choshu then attacked Ogawa in the crowd, which led to all the wrestlers trying to both break them up and get into the fight. Ogawa challenged Choshu to a match. Choshu asked Ogawa to ask his new best friend Hashimoto about him. It seemed to set up either Choshu versus Ogawa for the May 5th Fukuoka Dome, which is a marquee match, or Choshu and Liger versus Ogawa and Murakami, which would be a great match because of Liger and Murakami, and could be used to extend the program to lead to a singles, but not have the marquee value. Hashimoto also later issued a challenge for a tag match where he'd team with either Ogawa or Fujita against Choshu and Fujinami for Fukuoka Dome. 5. Choshu, Mitsuo Kwak, and Shiro Koshinaka beat Toshiaki Kawada and Masafuchi in 8:53. Because of just finishing the angle with Ogawa, this match couldn't follow it and really took the crowd's attention away for the first ever meeting of Choshu versus Kawada. No doubt viewers went irate when they cut to a commercial again at the opening bell. Fans were into Kawada pretty good, but not as good as they should have been or were at the previous 2 Dome shows. They didn't take Fuchi seriously at all at this level. The All Japan vs New Japan feud was clearly killed by this match being just a follow-up to the big angle ending when Choshu used the lariat to pin Fuchi. 6. Yuji Nagata pinned Manabu Nakanishi in 9:29 to earn an IWGP Heavyweight title match on May 5th at the Fukuoka Dome. Good match. Hard kicks to Nagata and hard chops by Nakanishi, which resulted in Nagata's chest being filled with welts. Nagata used an Enzui-Jiri and a second high kick to the forehead and got the pin. Fans expected Nakanishi to win and were a little surprised at the finish, also because the match was shorter than expected. 7. In what was generally considered the best match on the show, Masahiro Chono and Hiroyoshi Tenzan and Satoshi Kojima beat Keiji Muto and Taiyo Kia, Manukia Mossman, and Jinsei Shinzaki, Kensuke Shinzaki, in 14:57. It's kind of strange in that Chono has been out of action since the February 18th pay-per-view selling rib injuries. Really his bad neck was bothering him, from a match with Don Fry. Fry is Muto's regular tag team partner and didn't even appear on the show after first being booked against Scott Norton before Inoki switched the card because nobody cared about the original lineup, nor the second lineup, as it turned out. Said to be a great match, but very Americanized. Hiroshi Hazi was at ringside doing announcing. Hazi is apparently a great color commentator. People were furious when they switched to a commercial right at the bell. Kia looked excellent. Kia juiced, apparently hard way, from above his left eye. After Muto dropkicked Chono out of the ring, Chono attacked Hazi. Muto fought his way out of Kojima and Tenzan's 3D. Hazi then gave Muto his chair to use on Chono. Tatsutoshi Goto and Michiyoshi Ohara of Team 2000 attacked Muto. In the ring, Shinzaki used a powerbomb on Kojima for a near fall. All 3 heels attacked Shinzaki using a Yakuza kick, a Kojima cutter, another Yakuza kick for a near fall, a lariat by Kojima, and finally a third Yakuza kick for the pin by Chono. At that point, Hazi took off his suit and hit the ring, delivering urinages to Chono, Kojima and Tenzan, and then covered Kojima while Muto jumped into the ring and counted 3. Hazi then challenged Chono to a singles match and told Chono he wants his final answer, in reference to the Japanese version of Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, which is a hot show there right now. Chono said that Hazi should be spending his time taking care of his best friend, in reference to former Prime Minister Mori, who is Hazi's friend. Mori even campaigned for Hazi to win his seat in the Japanese Diet, and resigned when his approval ratings fell to about 10% last week due to the Japanese economy being in such bad shape. People popped when Chono brought up Hazi's best friend. 8. Kazuyuki Fujita beat Scott Norton in 6:43 to win the IWGP Heavyweight title. Fujita came to the ring with Inoki's original IWGP Heavyweight title belt given to him at the March 25th Pride show. This was billed as a no-rules match under Pride rules, which meant no pinfalls, only submission or knockout finish, but with no time limit or rounds. They tried to work it like a shoot, but Norton has no experience at that, so it wasn't very good, but told it wasn't awful and people were thankful for that. Fujita did not get a big pop coming out, despite holding wins over Hans Nyman, Mark Kerr and Ken Shamrock in Pride. The gimmick was that Fujita, Inoki's protege, was being sent to New Japan to take its world title. Where I see this as going, and this actually makes sense if you put yourself into Inoki's 70s mentality, is this. Fujita is now undisputed World Heavyweight Champion of New Japan Pro Wrestling, and he's legit, and the IWGP belt was the belt Inoki held in the 80s. Mark Coleman holds the WWF World Martial Arts title as well as the Pride World Heavyweight title. The martial arts title is the same belt Inoki held on and off for more than 10 years. If they match up Coleman versus Fujita for both belts, not only will the winner merge in this fantasy world the world titles of pro wrestling with Pride, But the belts they will be fighting over are the two belts that Inoki held during his prime, which would emphasize that Inoki in his day was both the best pro wrestler as well as the best shoot fighter. That also makes the IWGP belt in pro wrestling into the real pro wrestling world title, since it's the only world title belt that is defended against real fighters. I know today this all sounds silly, but if you understand the thought process of the 70s and earlier in pro wrestling, that does make sense. Now, I can't explain Scott Norton as world champion. Inoki came out to do commentary. Johnston and Gary Goodridge came out in Fujita's corner while Norton had Team 2000 members in his corner. Bell rang, and they went to commercials. You can imagine how the TV audience felt by this point. In that book of How to Destroy a Wrestling Company based on WCW the past few years, we may need to add a chapter from a Japanese perspective. Norton beat the hell out of Fujita early, which is Fujita's pride gimmick, since Kerr and Shamrock beat the hell out of him early as well until they tired out and he somehow beat them both. Norton did pro wrestling moves like a lariat and a power bomb. They also did a spot where Norton held Fujita in a front facelock and started throwing knees to the head. Similar to what Coleman and Vanderlei Silva did under the new Pride rules to get over its Pride rules. Team 2000 and Johnston and Goodridge started fighting outside the ring and Johnston punched Norton, leading to Chono and Tenzan attacking Johnston. Norton destroyed Fujita some more until Fujita made the comeback with a spear, got the mount and started punching. Norton escaped and got a mount and started punching, but Fujita went for an armbar from the bottom. Norton tried to power out. Fujita quickly changed position to get behind him and got a choke. Norton didn't tap, but sold it like he was out and ref Masao Hattori stopped the match. They sold it on TV like a wrestler from Pride won New Japan's world title and Fujita left with both belts, and it was announced Fujita vs Nagata for the title of the Fukuoka Dome. 9. In the main event, another no rules no time limit match, Shinya Hashimoto beat Kensuke Sasaki in 7:52, continuing the theme of Inoki's guys beating New Japan. They tried to work it like a shoot, which I guess Inoki feels they need to do in matches involving his guys to get the feud over as a shoot, not understanding the difference between 100% believability, which pro wrestling can't have, and working a style that allows suspension of disbelief, which is what pro wrestling in this type of situation should be, and they are very different, which limited what they could do. They also had to rush to get the finish on TV. There were some really stiff exchanges of hard cops, slaps, and Hashimoto even threw some relatively hard punches to Sasaki's face. Finish saw Hashimoto deliver a brainbuster, and since there were no pins, he just started savagely kicking Sasaki when he was down, Silva Sakuraba finish, until the match was stopped. There wasn't a big pop for the finish because wrestling fans were expecting Sasaki to make a comeback because the big show main event should be longer. So it was that silence. They didn't boo or anything. It was just trying to digest the strange show when it was over. As has been expected for some time, HHG Corporation, the parent company of Extreme Championship Wrestling, officially filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy on April 4, claiming $8,881,435 in outstanding debts with $1,385,500 in assets, making the company $7,495,935 in debt, not including potential unfavorable results of litigation. According to an article by Frank Jewett and John Williams at theotherarena.com, the debts do not include amounts listed as unknown to some wrestlers, as well as potential debts from 13 different pending lawsuits, including the much-publicized Eric Kula's case. The biggest debt is to the family of Paul Heyman, listed at $3.8 million. Heyman himself also declared personal bankruptcy in the wake of ECW going down. Other major debts include large amounts owed to various business partners, including $1 million to Acclaim, $300,000 to Farm Club, $250,000 to the original San Francisco Toymakers, and $150,000 to In Demand, the pay-per-view distributor. HHG is due far smaller amounts from some of the partners, including $50,000 from Acclaim and $10,000 from the original San Francisco Toymakers. In Demand, which still owes the company an estimated $800,000 from its share of revenues of previous pay-per-view events, is the only major creditor that actually owes ECW more money than ECW owes it. Another large source of debt is money owed to television stations, to wrestling talent, and a surprising source, World Wrestling Federation Entertainment. Although rumors, and even confirmation from those within the WWF for years had stated the two companies had a business relationship, clearly there was one, since WWF for a time sent contracted talent to ECW for Paul Heyman to attempt to revitalize their career, which worked to a degree with Al Snow and the head gimmick and didn't work with Dan Crawford and Doug Furness in the most notable examples. HHG listed $587,500 as money owed to WWFE and 2 loans taken out in recent months, apparently as last-ditch efforts for survival. HHG listed its tape library as an asset and listed its value at $500,000, and with no money to repay the WWFE debt, one would think part of that debt could be relieved by ECW giving WWFE its tape library and all future rights to the tapes, since the tapes are of less value to any of the other creditors, although to do so would require 2 separate processes, getting a settlement on the debt and using the settlement to then purchase the rights to the videotapes, since the bankruptcy involves the court. There apparently was at least preliminary interest at one point by the WWF in buying ECW, but the size of the debt may have been the overriding factor in the deal not happening. ECW owed $244,000 to Madison Square Garden Cable in New York before losing the television, as well as $243,000 to American Cable Productions, America One, as well as $64,000 to William Byrd Productions, who produced the TNN show, and $60,000 to Vigal Broadcasting out of Chicago, for its time slot in that market. There were also smaller amounts owed to arenas, radio stations, ad agencies, print shops, as well as lighting and Atlas security revolving around the live arena events held in the last several months the company was in business. Other outstanding bills included $140,000 in legal bills to Hoffinger, Friedland, Dobrich and Stern, $50,000 in accounting bills to Donahue, Garanda and Doria CPA, a $16,659 hospital bill left in Orlando, Florida that was never paid, and $11,700 in travel expenses from Discount Travel of Baton Rouge, Bob Ryder's company. There are also large debts to Steve Carl, both $50,000 personally and another $120,000 to Carl's companies, Stonecutter Productions and Stonecutter Event Promotions. Listed debt to contract wrestlers and other performers under contract were listed as Rob Sotkowski, Van Dam, $150,000, Tom Laughlin, Dreamer, $100,000, Joseph Bonsignori, Joey Styles, $50,480, Terry Guerin, Rhino, $50,000, Troy Martin, Shane Douglas, $48,000, Francine Fournier, $47,275, Mike DePaoli, Roadkill, $21,250, Don Callis, $12,000, Don Murray, $9,000, Yoshihiro Tajiri, $5,000, Francisco Islas, Super Crazy, $5,000 as well as $12,000 more to Tajiri and Islas manager, Victor Quinones and unknown figures. Not included in the total debt to Jim Mitchell and Jerome Young, New Jack. HHG claims no money owed to only 2 contracted performers, Terry Brunk, Sabu, and Steve Corino, both of whom ended up on the worst terms with Heyman. Whatever money that would come in from demand from previous pay-per-view shows, or royalties from licensees, would be dispersed at a certain percentage on the dollar to the various listed creditors. In a year already filled with major companies ceasing to exist because of huge losses and long-time wrestling traditions ending, yet another lengthy tradition appears to be ending this week, the last of the old studio wrestling shows. WMC TV informed Power Pro Wrestling over the weekend that the final show in the studio would be the live show on April 14th, ending a tradition at the station's studio that dates back more than 2 decades. It is not exactly clear why the decision was made, as the ratings had remained strong, but it could be that Raycom Media, which owns the station, simply couldn't understand why it was paying for a studio wrestling show when other stations were being paid to air tapes. The decision also puts the future of Power Pro Wrestling in jeopardy, since the promotion was largely funded by WMC TV paying a weekly fee for the show, perhaps being the only local station in the country to still pay for local wrestling programming. One of the reasons the station had such a deal is because the wrestling show historically has been a huge ratings draw. At its peak during the early and mid-80s, the show drew off the charts audiences, frequently topping a 20 rating and a 70 share in its Saturday morning time slot, and making people like Jerry Lawler, Lance Russell, Dave Brown and others into some of the most famous and well-known local celebrities. In the early 80s, there were weeks that the Saturday morning wrestling show beat out all but the top 1 or 2 primetime network shows. Even of late, with its ratings topping the 5.0 mark in recent weeks with Lawler's return, it was likely the highest-rated local wrestling show in the United States, and Memphis remained the best television market for wrestling as it was the one market where SmackDown consistently beat NBC programming. All the old territorial wrestling companies died in the late 80s and through the 90s, as did virtually all the local televised wrestling shows, many of them local institutions, but none were more of an institution than the Memphis show. It was the highest-rated television wrestling show in the United States throughout the 80s. The Memphis promotion, which underwent many different names changes, last being known as the USWA, co-owned by Lawler and Jerry Jarrett during its glory and not-so-glory days, also died in 1997 in the fallout of a sale to Cleveland investors for an inflated price which ended up in a quick messy bankruptcy and series of lawsuits. It was believed that was the end of the show, as station general manager Mason Granger canceled the show shortly after moving it out of its time slot for children's programming to a late-night slot. This was done as the company was falling apart, particularly after differences between Larry Burton, a shady associate of Lawler who brokered the deal and ended up on the losing end of some of those lawsuits, and Brown, the most popular local news personality who doubled as wrestling announcer. After the children's programming failed to draw a rating, Granger made a deal with Randy Hales, who worked as Jarrett's general manager for several years before Burton's arrival for the old company, with help of Lawler, to recreate the program in its old time slot in April of 1998. All the ownership papers were in Hales' name because it would look bad with the USWA lawsuits still ongoing, like he had been involved in bankrupting the company and then reopening it under a new name. Granger, one day before he resigned as GM of the station, seemingly kept the show afloat, not knowing how future GMs would take to the idea of paying for a live wrestling show, since the tradition became that wrestling should pay for airtime, regardless of the ratings it draws, by signing Hales' PPW promotion to a 3-year contract which saw the station pay for production in their studio as well as pay a $1,500 weekly fee for the show, which was coming up for renewal. The 3 years saw the company undergo many twists and turns. They did a very successful reopen, drawing strong ratings in some good early houses using Lawler and occasional WWF talent like Jim Cornette and Michael Hayes, as well as being the first WWF developmental territory, including the early matches of Kurt Angle. After the lawsuit was settled, there were problems between Lawler and Hales over Hales' testimony in the case, and Lawler pulled out of the promotion. He then convinced Vince McMahon to pull the WWF deal from Hales and switch it to Terry Golden's Memphis Championship Wrestling, which had been running brutal hardcore-style opposition under the name Kick-Ass Wrestling. When all the WWF talent pulled out as well as their financial help, it left Hales with a weak crew, and little left of the promotion, built around a wrestler named Ali and manager Brandon Baxter, besides the weekly television show. Business got so bad he largely had to give up promoting spot shows. The promotion was struggling badly for several months until Lawler and Hales settled their problems. The developmental talent began working for both promotions. Hales was put back on the WWF payroll and his television was used to promote Golden spot shows, which also didn't draw unless WWF talent was brought in. Lawler's return to the traditional television slot brought ratings up to 5.0 on a good week. However, it all started unraveling when Lawler quit the WWF after McMahon fired Stacey Carter, his wife, on February 27. WMC TV, wanting the ratings Lawler could deliver, as the numbers fell to a 2.5 using the WWF talent without Lawler on March 10, pushed for Lawler to be put back on the show. Hales, faced with having to satisfy either the station or the WWF, chose the station, since they were the ones paying for the television show, and brought Lawler back on March 17, resulting in WWF pulling its talent from the show. Even with a non-end to all angles and the WWF champs not losing the title belts on the show, ratings immediately doubled. WWF had offered to have their guys drop the belts on television, but only if Lawler wasn't allowed to appear on the same show. After the ratings picked back up, the station, 3 weeks later, informed Power Pro they were canceling the show. Apparently the pay-per-view finisher in the Pero Aguayo Universo 2000 match was really sick. Basically started as a pile driver but then turned into a Liger bomb. The media in both the US, Spanish-language media, and Mexico are covering it as if it's a huge news story and that he really has a broken neck. In Mexico City, the injury to Aguayo, 55, the most loved wrestler in Mexico of this generation and probably the top overall drawing card of the past 2 decades in Mexico, have been covered huge daily over the past week. It is the first time a wrestling story, at least in many years, has been covered on Televisa's most important news program Joaquin Lopez, as well as daily coverage on Primero Noticias, which is the most watched news program in Mexico. Reports are that the March 30th show from Arena Mexico was the second best of the 4 pay-per-view events the company has done, obviously trailing the March 17, 2000 show, which was voted in this newsletter's poll as the best show of last year. We will hopefully have a review of the show next week, but apparently every match was good except the main event, and that wasn't terrible either. The mystery guy in the Pierre Roth Jr. mask who threw water in Aguayo's eyes turned out to be Pierre Roth's son, and since he can't very well be Pierre Roth Jr., although at one point Cobarde Jr.'s son did use that name until they just had the dad become Cobarde and the son be Cobarde Jr. His wrestling name is Leo del Pierroth Jr., and lucky for him, he debuted in Mexico City in the main event on April 10th. Should be noted that unlike most Lucha Libre Juniors who are sons of famous wrestlers, or in the case of Rey Mysterio Jr., a nephew, Pierroth was the name of a famous clown, not that they haven't had clowns wrestle in Mexico, not a wrestler. The issue of content of WWF television, which has surfaced on and off for the past 3 years, has resurfaced with another major advertiser pulling out of SmackDown, a negative ruling against TSN in Canada, ironically a station heavily criticized by wrestling fans of editing SmackDown, as well as a somewhat critical MSNBC special on April 10th. Some of this latest round of controversy was no doubt sparked by the Vince McMahon interview on the Bob Costas on the Record show, and in particular, the angle where Trish Stratus stripped on Raw and barked like a dog. However, the timing of that was only coincidental to a Canadian Broadcast Standards Council ruling that came down on April 10th regarding several viewer complaints on show content. Among the issues was the angle where Mae Young gave birth to a hand, which was criticized in a viewer complaint as being vulgar, sleazy, sexist and violent. Well, you could argue sleazy but not violent, but probably stupid best fits the description. The Canadian Association of Broadcasters Sex Role Portrayal Code and Violence Code have no regulations against stupidity in program content, and actually does the ruling as to why the segment didn't violate any guidelines. The fact that the segment is absurd does not render it exploitative, the panel stated in its ruling. In other words, it was too silly to be taken seriously. However, the panel came down on both TSN and Raw as war for code violations, in particular violating the National Television Code regarding sexist portrayals and remarks made during broadcasts by the likes of Jim Ross and Chris Irvine, including references to female characters on the show as wearing a $2 walking suit. I actually don't remember that one, that little horny she-devil, Ross on Terry Boatwright, and filthy, dirty, disgusting, brutal, skanky, bottom-feeding trash bag hoe, which I think actually turned into a Chris Jericho catchphrase at one point. The council also found fault with TSN for failing to provide adequate on-air viewer advisories during Raw is War telecasts due to content of the shows. TSN is obliged to air a primetime statement that the channel had violated the Sex Role Portrayal Code. TSN has been placed in a no-win situation, as noted by a quote in the Canadian press regarding the ruling by spokesman David Rosenblum, who said, "We have to be mindful and responsible to the viewers, those who feel the program should be edited more, a lot more who feel it should be edited less." On the same day, it was announced that Pep Boys has pulled out of advertising on SmackDown due to pressure from the PTC. According to a letter explaining the decision by Pep Boys Senior Vice President Frederick Stampano, "We have spent considerable time reviewing the recent content of WWF SmackDown and have come to the conclusion that it is not an appropriate advertising vehicle for Pep Boys. It will be interesting to see if they advertise on Raw, which would show the decision is totally hypocritical. If they pull out of WWF entirely, which if they review tapes and decide they don't want to be advertised, you can disagree with it, but it would be a consistent decision. Some of the Vince Trish stuff doesn't play well in the real world." TSN edited most of the final angle involving Steve Austin and Triple H beating on Lita, including numerous chair shots, off television the previous night. The second straight weekend angle was edited off television due to violence against women. TSN went to several minutes of crowd shots rather than show the pounding Lita was taking, and then went off the air with the show still in progress to switch to the next show. A past midnight replay of the show kept the same edits, but that version kept the show on until its conclusion rather than skipping out of the show a few minutes early. It is almost a sure thing that Sky Sports this weekend in the UK won't air most of the angle as well. Sky joined TSN in editing off of Raw the segments from last week where Trish was getting whipped with a belt while Regal was holding her. Neither station edited off when Rhino gored Molly. Perhaps the idea that using wrestling maneuvers on women are okay, but usage of objects, a belt last week, a chair this week, on women isn't. Or perhaps it's just an inconsistency in application. Also on April 10th, MSNBC's The News with Brian Williams aired a segment about pro wrestling, basically doing surface arguments on whether or not it was lowbrow entertainment, focusing largely on the degradation of women aspects, no doubt inspired by McMahon's reactions to Costas on HBO. The show broke no new ground, nor did either side get the chance to give any arguments with any depth to them. A state senator in Connecticut said that women are portrayed in a bad light on WWF broadcasts. Some are, actually all are at some point, but all men on the show are at some point as well. All the male characters are not exploited for sexual degradation anywhere near the degree of the female characters. China said that pro wrestling is not a babysitter for children, which it shouldn't be, but rightly or wrongly, it serves as one. She also said she couldn't see anyone that could make the argument women are treated unfairly in the WWF. Bradshaw compared WWF to Shakespeare and said the company goes overboard when it comes to responsibility of what it puts on the air, now saying that is going a little overboard. Costas was interviewed, and when talking about McMahon's behavior on the show, Costas noted that McMahon was an intelligent man but more than that, a showman, and that he stated his case as well as he could. Costas said because there is an audience for something doesn't justify the product itself, and noted he was a wrestling fan at one time. Costas said the straightest angle in question never should have aired on television in the first place, a view agreed with in both Canada and the UK, both countries of which edited much of it off. Williams actually tried to defend it by saying Trish would get her revenge in the end, some revenge, and even if she got total revenge, that's a complete lack of a logical reasoning, because in a porn movie, for example, if a woman is violated, but ends up at the end of the movie blowing the head off the guy who violates her, how does the ending plotline and her getting or not getting revenge make a difference as to whether or not it is a porn movie? Costas said he had no problem with violence as far as angles or match content on pro wrestling, since it wasn't real violence. Williams asked Costas about McMahon's argument that if you don't like it, change the channel. Costas said parents should take some responsibility for what their kids watch, but saying that doesn't absolve WWF from taking responsibility for the product they air, noting WWF directly markets their product toward kids. The wrestling war has really heated up in Puerto Rico this month, and it appears that both companies are benefiting. The IWA's Juicio final tour all weekend was a huge success, as they climaxed the angle that appears to have been one of the key components in what has really been a remarkable turnaround from a company that just 4 months ago was close to being out of existence. Much of the turnaround of both companies goes back to Dutch Mantel, who was WWC Booker, quitting the company and going with IWA as Booker. However, the momentum had started turning when it came to WWC crowds starting to go down and IWA starting to become profitable a few weeks before Mantel made the switch. The big angle, teasing a reuniting of Los Boricuas, Hombre Dinamita, Savio Vega, Huracan Castillo and Miguel Perez, finally climaxed on the company's biggest show of the year on April 7th at the Papan Castro Coliseum in Bayamon, which drew a sellout of more than 6,000 fans, with another 2,000 turned away at the door according to police estimates, as well as another 1,000 cars turned away at the parking lot as they arrived after the sellout but without any tickets. The various parties have done saves for each other on the weekly big shows, which now top 2,000 paid most weeks. For the Saturday night show in the San Juan metropolitan area, they were doing under 500 just a few months ago in the same cities, but Perez kept refusing to rejoin the group. On the same night, WWC cut ticket prices from the usual $10 and $5 to $5 and $2, and drew 6,500 fans in Carolina. IWA was charging $45, $20 and $10 in Bayamon. Carolina and Bayamon are about 15 minutes apart, both in the San Juan metropolitan area, which has about 2 million of the approximately 4 million people who live in Puerto Rico, a traditional wrestling hotbed, particularly in the late 70s when Carlos Colon caught fire as a draw and the company had one of the most incredible boom periods featuring many huge crowds at outdoor stadiums, through the death of Bruiser Brody in 1988, which the business never fully recovered from. WWC still draws stronger television ratings based on the tradition of the show, but WWC has had many recent shows that have drawn poorly despite drawing out of this world TV numbers. IWA, which was dying at the gate most of last year, losing $989,000 for the year, suddenly, just as owner Victor Quiñones was about to make the call to give it up, started turning things around and is now running at a profit every week. IWA runs with higher ticket prices, particularly when bringing in wrestlers from the WWF. Politically, the structure has changed as well. WWC had attempted to bring in wrestlers from WCW, but with the exception of Conan last month, it had fallen through. However, the WCW office had agreed to start sending them talent in April, including Conan, Jeff Jarrett and Scott Steiner, to help with the WWF-affiliated IWA. But when the office closed, all the names were pulled from the shows with the exception of Conan, who made a specific deal in his contract when he agreed to a huge pay cut in January which allowed him to work outside the United States, but not American Indies, when he wasn't booked by WCW. Something other WCW wrestlers under old contracts weren't allowed to do. The Bayamon show, which was taped and will eventually air in Puerto Rico as a pay-per-view event, featured introductions of former wrestlers Thomas Marin, an early 70s WWF jobber, Jose Miguel Perez Sr., who actually headlined more Madison Square Garden sellouts in the late 50s as Argentina Rocca's tag team partner than all but about a half dozen men in history, and Gilberto Melendez, longtime Japanese star Gypsy Joe. 1. Andy Anderson and Chicano and Brian Madness beat Visago, Chicago indie wrestler Brett Sanders, and Anarchy Pablo Marquez when Anderson pinned Anarchy in 8:57. 2. Nuevo Gran Apollo pinned Gangrel with a Uranage in 9:27. Pharaon Zarux, a masked wrestler, did a run-in but Apollo used the Uranage on him as well. 3. Dutch Mantle and Heriberto Lopez beat Jose Estrada Sr., the WWF wrestler of the late 70s and early 80s, father of Jose Jr., who was one of the Boricuas in WWF a few years back, in a handicap match for the commissioner job that Estrada had just won. Lopez will probably work now as a heel commissioner, although they announced Mantle as the new commissioner since he scored the pin in 5:10. 4. La Malcriada, real name Aki Kanbayashi, former FMW woman wrestler Miss Mongol, who helps run Takamichi Noku's dojo in Puerto Rico, pinned Malia Hasaka in 4:55 of a women's match. 5. Super Crazy won a three-way over Essa Rios and Yoshihiro Tajiri in 3:32. Too short, but they all traded hot moves. Anderson attacked Crazy but Rios saved Crazy. Anderson then attacked Rios but was stopped by Tajiri kicking the hell out of him. 6. Huracan Castillo Jr. pinned Terry Funk in 10:16 of an IWA Hardcore title match. Big time bloodbath using lots of objects. Second best match on the show. Funk again was turned babyface as both men shook hands when the match was over. 7. Hombre Dinamita pinned Steve Strong, former Calgary wrestler Steve DeSalvo, who was trained in the same class as Sting and Ultimate Warrior and was a big draw in Puerto Rico in the late 80s, feuding with Carlos Colon but has been retired for many years, in 9:27 when Chicky Star tried to hit Dinamita with a chair, but he moved and Strong got hit. 8. In what was reported as the best match so far this year in Puerto Rico, Shane pinned Ricky Banderas in 23:42 in a double ladder match to win the IWA Heavyweight title. Finish saw both men on the top of the ladder and Banderas went for a punch with a foreign object, missed, lost his balance and fell off the ladder, allowing Shane to grab the belt. 9. Kane and WWF Spanish language announcer Hugo Savinovich beat Chicky Star and Victor the Bodyguard when Kane choke slammed Star and Savinovich scored the pin. Kane also choke slammed manager Abana, but afterwards, Kane turned heel and choke slammed Savinovich, who was celebrating. 10. Main event was billed as a cage death match, basically the old WWC Final Justice gimmick match, a takeoff on War Games but with a different twist, with the idea the match continues until all members of a team are handcuffed to the cage and the other team can beat on them. It was announced that Kane just turned heel and it wouldn't have worked with him in this match because he'd have to sell so much, and Zarux, injured earlier in the show, were out of the match, making it 4-on-4 instead of 5-on-5. Strong and Star and Victor and Banderas ended up beating Dinamita and Apollo and Shane and Castillo in 1846. It wound up with Victor and Banderas left with Apollo. Apollo was able to handcuff Victor. Banderas and Apollo went at it for 3:40 before Banderas handcuffed Apollo, and then got the keys off a pole to unlock his teammates. Mantle and Angel did a run-in, so there were 6 heels against 4 handcuffed faces. Zarux, a heel, ran in and went after Castillo, but instead gave him a key to unlock himself. Fans began chanting that it was Perez and not Zarux away. Zarux attacked the heels with a kendo stick until they gained the advantage on him, but by this point Castillo was able to unhandcuff the faces. Zarux then unmasked as Perez, who then grabbed the mic and said he was a Boricua, ending the big story. The show ended at 12:45 am and nobody left early. They also started the Apollo heel turn since he was mad he was not part of the Boricuas reunion. WWC is responding with a major show called Primaverazo on April 14 outdoors at Juan Lubriel Stadium in Bayamon, head-to-head with IWA returning to Bayamon for Fan Appreciation Day at the same Coliseum. WWC show will be headlined by Ray Gonzalez defending the Universal title against Carly Colon, Abdullah the Butcher, 64 versus Kimala, 51 Conan versus Fidel Sierra, Invader I versus El Nene for the Puerto Rican title, Thunder and Lightning versus Eddie Watts and Rico Suave for the WWC tag team titles in a hardcore match, Damian Steele versus Eddie Colon in a cage match for the WWC junior title, Stacy Colon versus La Tigresa, El Bronco versus Paul LeDuc, Rex King versus Chris Grant for the WWC TV title, and Super Gladiator versus Black Boy in a mask versus mask match. Several pro wrestlers and MMA big names are among those scheduled at the biggest submission event of the year, the annual Abu Dhabi Combat Classic 2001, held from April 11 to April 13. This will be the first year that major name pro wrestlers are involved, In particular Kiyoshi Tamura and Tsuyoshi Kosaka of Rings and Yoshiaki Yatsu of the Social Pro Wrestling Federation. There are 5 16-man tournaments in different weight classes, as well as an absolute tournament which will allow the highest placing fighters, regardless of weight, to compete. The main event of April 13th pits 2 fighters undefeated under these rules, Mario Sperry against 2-time heavyweight tournament champion Mark Kerr. Among the names involved include at 143 pounds, Royler Gracie, Joey Gilbert, a former NCAA champion who is on the next UFC show, and Barrett Yoshida. At 167 pounds, among those involved are Genki Sudo of Pancrase, Rodrigo Gracie Kaoru Uno, from the last UFC who worked Antonio Inoki's New Year's Eve wrestling show, Tetsuji Kato of Shudo, Jean-Jacques Machado, Takanori Gomi of Shudo and Matt Serra, on the next UFC show. At 191 pounds include Alexander Sapko Sasha, a big-name wrestler, Akira Gono, Shudo, Saulo Ribeiro, last year's winner, who then lost almost immediately on the Coliseum show to Yuki Kondo at the Tokyo Dome. Enzo Gracie, why he's going in at this weight instead of 167 underlies his recent NHB problems. Sananae Kikuta, Pancrase, Evan Tanner, USWF/UFC/Pancrase Tamura, Egan Inoue, Pride, and Ricardo Liborio, a big name in the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu world. At 215 pounds include Ricardo Almeida, a big name in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, Ricardo Arona, another name from Brazil, Regan Machado and Kosaka. In the heavyweight division will include former ADCC champ Jeff Monson, who lost to Chuck Liddell in AUFC, Tom Erickson, former U.S. freestyle champion, Roberto Traven, a BJJ world champion who is in the Rings tournament, Mike Van Arsdale, freestyle wrestler whose only MMA loss was to Wanderlei Silva, Sean Alvarez, Vitor Belfort, who he isn't competing at 215 is a question, Mark Robinson, the 290-pounder from South Africa who was knocked out in the last UFC, Rico Rodriguez and Yatsu, who placed in the 1976 Olympics before being a major pro wrestling star in the 80s and is far too old for this sort of thing. TNN ratings for both wrestling and football for the weekend were unavailable at press time. SmackDown on April 5th drew a 4.3 rating and 7 share, which is below average for the show, but about the level the show has been drawing most weeks since February. NBC was in reruns, so the competition was easier than usual even against Survivor, 16.5, and CSI, 12.8. Friends only did an 8.8, and even as a rerun, that number is scary for that show. The final XFL regular season game on NBC drew a 1.7 rating and 3 share based on the Fast Nationals, which, if the number holds up, would make it the second lowest rated. Only the game from 3 weeks ago would top it, night of programming in the history of television on one of the big 4 networks. The final regular season game on UPN drew an 0.6 rating and 1 share, which is the lowest network rating I've ever heard of. Livewire on March 31st did a 1.09 rating and Superstars on April 1st did an 0.98. Galavision Lucha Libre on April 3rd drew a 1.3 Hispanic rating, although it drew a 2.8 rating in the target male 18 to 34 demo. A funny thing about these ratings. I think a 2.8 in the target male 18 to 34 is actually more viewers than a 1.3 overall. Observer poll results. Traditional Observer pay-per-view poll results based on phone calls, fax messages and emails to the Observer as of Tuesday, April 10th. Pride 13. Thumbs up 73, 97.3%. Thumbs down 2.7%. In the middle 0.0%. Best match poll Kazushi Sakuraba vs. Wanderlei Silva, 39. Trey Tilligman vs. Igor Vovchankin, 31. Worst match poll Masaaki Sadake vs. Tadao Yasuda, 67. IATA poll results. Results of the daily poll on the IATA.com website. New questions will be up every day at approximately 3 p.m. Eastern Time, with the results being announced at the start of the Wrestling Observer Live Internet audio show the following day as well as each week here. What did you think was the best match at Wrestlemania? A. Rock vs. Steve Austin 29.3%. B. Undertaker vs. Triple H 7.3%. C. TLC 2 15.4%. Chris Benoit vs. Kurt Angle 31.7%. E. Didn't see the show 16.2%. What did you think of Raw, April 3rd? A. Excellent 5.4%. B. Good 21.0%. C. Average 38.3%. D. Bad 22.8%. E. Awful 12.6%. A. Randy Savage vs. Ricky Steamboat 1987 26.1%. B. Owen Hart vs. Bret Hart 1994 20.5%. C. Shawn Michaels vs. Razor Ramon 1994 20.8%. D. Bret Hart vs. Steve Austin 1997 25.4%. E. Rock vs. Steve Austin 2001 7.2%. It is possible to run a profitable national wrestling company against the WWF today? A. Number 26.6%. B. Yes, but only by copying WWF style 2.6%. C. Yes, but only by coming up with your own style 35.2%. D. Yes, doing old style but with good booking and logic 35.6%. For back issues of The Observer, the Wrestling Observer Index lists almost every issue in our history going back more than 17 years with the major headlines by the week. Besides as a guide for ordering back issues, the index is also a great way to keep a catalog of past issues and use for historical purposes. It is available for $15 from Grand Swarich, 151 Hart Avenue, Peterborough, Ontario, K9J5C5, Canada. Virtually every back issue from 1982-91 is available from him at prices listed plus $5 for postage for overseas orders. Most issues from 1992 present are available from us at $4 per issue. If you are ordering back issues from us, please denote back issues on the envelope to ensure the quickest response. All payments to Grant or to us must be made in U.S. funds. We are also working with Powerbomb Publishing, www.powerbomb.com, to have reissues of some of the most popular Wrestling Observer publications of the past. We have the 200-page book Tributes, featuring life stories on Andre the Giant Bruiser Brody, Junkyard Dog Brian Pillman, Louis Piccoli, Dick the Bruiser, Buddy Rogers, Kerry Von Erich, Fritz Von Erich, Boris Malenko, Art Barr, Eddie Gilbert, John Studd, Ray Stevens, Dick Murdoch, Jerry Graham and others for $25. We have 1987, 1988, 1989 and 1990 Observer yearbooks for $15. We have 1983, 1984, and 1986 Observer yearbooks for $12. We also have the 1986 Wrestling Observer's Who's Who in Wrestling book for $20. For each order, add $4 for postage and handling within North America, $6 for surface mail worldwide or $14 for airmail overseas. If you are ordering more than one book, you only need to add $1 extra postage per additional book. All payments should be made to Powerbomb at P.O. Box 1523, Harborough, North Carolina 27510. Wrestling Observer Live airs every Monday through Friday on the ayata.com sports and channel on the internet from 5 to 7 p.m. Eastern Time, and 2 to 4 p.m. Pacific Time. The show is available live throughout the world and the 5 previous shows are available along with numerous other shows featuring the biggest names in the industry 24 hours per day on archives, to listen to at your convenience. Brian Alvarez and I open the show every day running down the latest news. We either have guests the remainder of the show taking listeners' phone calls and emails, or we take calls and emails. Even if you don't have access to a computer and just want to talk wrestling, you can reach us between those hours within North America at 1-877-392-3299, 1-877-AYATA-99, or from outside North America you can call the international operator and ask to be connected and reverse charges. You can always email questions for the show 24 hours a day to us at davemeltzer@ayata.com. You can always check the WrestlingObserver.com website for the latest guest information. April 14th will be a tape show with Nova, a very good show. April 17th is scheduled as Ken Shamrock as our guest. April 18th we'll have Bruno Sammartino as our guest. April 19th will be Devin Crowbar Storm and April 20th will be author Chris Pope. While April 25th we'll be doing the show on location from Santa Ana, California at the UPW show. We're also on almost every Saturday night, preempted on April 14th. At about 5:15 p.m. and Sunday night at midnight on Talk 640 in Toronto for Wrestling Observer Extra as part of the live audio wrestling. We also have late breaking news headlines on WrestlingObserver.com, which also includes television reviews and columns written by Brian Alvarez and Alex Merves. Mexico. The biggest show of the year in Tijuana, called Destino Final Destiny, took place on April 6th at the Auditorio, headlined by Elio Del Santo putting up his mask against the hair of Nicho Psicosis. Really good near classic match. It was February 3rd, falls and went 29-23, and please don't ask who won. Both guys are huge favorites. Crowd heat was super, particularly toward the end since it built so well. Nicho played subtle heel and the crowd eventually turned greatly toward Santo, which worked, since he was going over. Santo isn't nearly the wrestler he was a few years ago due to all the flying he's done and his age, but Nicho did a tremendous job in carrying the match. Santo did a lot of good mat wrestling early and more than enough good high flying. Santo won the first fall with a Santo trademark camel clutch, La Caballo, that his father stole from Eddie Guerrero's father after a tope. Nicho won the second fall with an inverted top rope superplex. Tons of near falls in the third, including Santo doing the dive out of the ring, flipping and rolling over Nicho. Mysterio Jr. did this move on a recent WCW major show. Santo got a pin with a Rana after Nicho had survived a few near falls, although Nicho's hand hit the ropes. Nicho accepted the loss, raising Santo's arm and even putting him on his shoulders and carrying him around the ring to a huge ovation, and then allowing his head to get shaved bald. Santo said due to the controversial nature of the finish, he would like to give him a rematch. The semi saw Rey Mysterio Jr. over Juventud Guerrera to win the IWC Cruiserweight title belt we talked about last week. Match was one fall, going 9:40. Didn't have nearly the heat or emotion of the main event and was somewhat American style, but still a very good match with a cool bridging cradle finish. There was a huge pop when Mysterio Jr. went over, but not the caliber of the matches these two used to do when they feuded in Tijuana in 1996. Geez, I remember those matches. I saw these two do a February 3rd fall 25 minutes match in TJ that blew away, and I mean to where there wasn't even a comparison. The Hart-Michaels Mania match took place the same month. Guerrera did mic work before the match to establish himself as the heel, since he had been working as a face in Tijuana of late. The mic work took. Mil Mascaras worked the show, and even submitted in the second fall of a trios match that he and La Parka and Super Parka beat La Familia, Rey Mysterio and Damien and Halloween, via DQ in. With both refs distracted, Mysterio faked a low blow. La Parka saw, and right as both refs were turning around, he fell down, so you had both guys selling non-existent low blows like crazy on the mat. Parka is so ridiculously overplaying to the crowd that you just shake your head when you think about how WCW handled him. Then again, you could get permanent neck damage shaking your head at all the things WCW dropped the ball on that were handed to them. The face and heel refs would go to the fans asking which low blow was first, and the fans lied, since there was no low blow, cheering Parka. Finally, the face ref laid out the heel ref with a forearm and raised Parka's hand for the win to a pretty large pop. Tarzan Boy suffered a broken neck in a match on April 2nd in Merida. The rope snapped as he was bouncing off them and he fell unprotected to the floor, suffering a fractured 6th cervical vertebrae. He'll be out of action 6 months minimum. Charlie Manson, which is obviously not his real name, was seriously injured at the March 30th Rey de Reyes show in Ciudad Madero and was hospitalized all week. After doing a dive onto the AAA Psicosis, former Tijuana wrestler Leon Negro, he set up a ladder. The idea was for Psicosis to knock the ladder over and for him to fall off through a table. But the ladder broke as he was falling and he landed head first on the floor. His head made a sick thud on the floor. He suffered a fractured femur and a severe concussion and needed blood transfusions, and during the week they were looking for donors, which they found. It aired on TV in Mexico and was said to have been one of the sickest looking blown spots you will ever see. He'll be out of action 3 months minimum. Rey Bucanero re-injured himself on the April 1st tag title match at Arena Coliseo, so 2 members of the trio are now out of action, but he should be back in a week or 2. Panther beat Hater on April 1st in Monterrey to win his hair. April 6th Arena Mexico was headlined by the return of Gigante Silva, Giant Silva from WWF of a few years ago, a former member of the Brazilian Olympic basketball team who is over as a Latino Andre the Giant type attraction in Mexico, and Atlantis and Brazo de Plata over Los Hermanos Dinamita and Apollo Dantes via DQ when Universo kicked Silva low. They also had a one-night trios tournament, the finals of which only went 1 minute, with Mr. Niebla and Safari and Olympico beating Emilio Charles Jr. and Scorpio Jr. and Bestia Salvaje. Niebla and Safari and Olympico are apparently going to be pushed as a regular babyface trio called La Ola Azul, or the Blue Wave, wearing matching blue outfits. April 13th main event is Wagner Jr. and Negro Casas, and Satanico vs. Santo and Ultimo Guerrero and Charles Jr. and Parejas Increíbles, although it seems they are starting a Wagner face turn and Santo heel turn. Silva was moved to the semi with Villanos 3 and 4 against Scorpio Jr. and Salvaje and Dantes and El Signo. April 15th at Arena Coliseo in Mexico City has Charles vs. Ringo Mendoza in a hair vs. hair match. On April 6th in San Juan Pantilan, El Hijo del Solitario retained his mask in a mask vs. hair match over Halcón Infernal. Juventud Guerrera quit EMLL but not to join AAA. The whole thing was a big problem there. The belief is that Guerrera came back with a superstar attitude, made worse by the idea that a lot of the EMLL guys see themselves as the real luchadores and Guerrera never proved himself there. A lot of the guys made him look bad by not selling his stuff. He had that problem in Tijuana in some matches as well. He also got under the influence of Sabu, which is a bad influence on many levels, because Sabu is under the influence of Sheik and that 70s mentality that a big star doesn't do jobs, and that simply doesn't fly today. Guerrera quit because they put him in the third match. He worked in AAA date in Tijuana but is just working in Tijuana regularly as well as trying to get indie dates in the US on the small show on March 30th in Tijuana. Oriental beat Führer in a mask versus mask match, revealing him as Salvador Perez of Mexico City, and Venom Black beat King Azteca in a hair versus hair match. Puerto Rico. The Juicio Final Tour opened on April 5th in Manatí before a sellout of 2,600 fans. In the main matches, Essa Rios pinned Yoshihiro Tajiri in what was reported as a great match. Terry Funk pinned Super Crazy in a hardcore rules match which saw liberal interference from Andy Anderson. Nuevo Gran Apollo pinned Gangrel. Kane choke slammed Farhan Zarux with a choke slam quickly. In a really hot match which stole the show, Ricky Banderas retained the IWA title over Shane, and the main event was your typical bloody double strap match with Hombre Dinamita and Huracan Castillo Jr. over Chicky Star and Victor the Bodyguard. April 6th in Guayama before 3,000 included Crazy pinning Tajiri with a moonsault. Apollo pinned Rios with a Uranage. Castillo pinned Gangrel in a bloodbath. Dinamita beat Funk via pin after a sidekick, and Shane and WWF Spanish-language TV announcer Hugo Savinovich and Kane beat Banderas and Star and Victor when Shane pinned Banderas. Kane choke slammed three guys who interfered during the match as well as all three of the heels including Banderas, to set up the pin. In the Funk Dinamita match, Star and Victor attacked Dinamita after the match, but Funk turned babyface and saved him, and Funk and Dinamita shook hands and left together. The final bit show of the tour, on April 8th in San German, which didn't include Kane, drew 1,800. Taka Michinoku also missed the weekend due to an injury. Many of the undercard guys in IWA are students at Michinoku's wrestling school in Puerto Rico, and he is bringing them to Japan for Michinoku Pro. They are said to be very good. Some already with us a few months in the ring are better than guys who have wrestled for years. WWF will be sending people starting next week to IWA. No word on who, although I believe one of the people will be Russ McCulloch. New Japan also sent Masao Hattori over to investigate the idea of using IWA the same way they used to use Stampede Wrestling in the 80s, as a place to send younger wrestlers for seasoning so they can do the difficult transition. People see them as rookies, and it's hard for people to take them as stars unless they leave for a few years and come back having made a marked improvement and having a new look. After Stampede went under, they used the CWA group for that role, but CWA's for all real purposes done as well. WWC, to combat the big IWA show in Bayamon, held Fans Day on April 7th in Carolina, Puerto Rico with all tickets at $5 and $2 and drew 6,500 people for a show built around a battle royal for the Carolina Major Cup, won by Carly Colon when he threw out Eddie Watts. Colon was given the cup, but during the presentation, Ray Gonzalez broke the cup over his head and Carly juiced for the first time in his career. Also they had Carlos and Carly and Eddie Colon team together, for what may have been the first time ever, losing to top heels Gonzalez and returning Fidel Sierra, who had been touring England as Cuban Assassin, and Damian Steele due to interference of La Tigresa in Fantasy, Sierra's wife and valet. Invader I regained the Puerto Rican title in the main event beating Paul LeDuc, who is no relation to any of the pro wrestling LeDucs. All Japan. The champion Carnival came down to Genichiro Tenryu vs Taiyokia on April 11th in Sendai. Going into the final night of the round robin, April 10th in Akita, before 2,250 fans, Tenryu had 15 points and was guaranteed a spot in the finals. Toshiaki Kawada had 14 points and only needed a draw with Steve Williams to make the finals. Kia and Mike Barton were to wrestle each other, each with 15 points, so the winner would go to the finals. First, Kia pinned Barton in 13-17 after the Hawaiian Crusher, so he clinched a spot in either a 2- or 3-man final. However, Williams beat Kawada via submission with an armbar in 16:59. They did the storyline that Kawada had injured his arm in the Osaka Dome match the previous night against Riki Choshu. He started selling the arm after delivering a hard lariat, and Williams eventually took advantage for the submission. Since Kawada was on the losing end at Osaka Dome and in a big match the next night, one would think he's due a big win, which would come on April 14th at Budokan Hall in his first ever singles match with Keiji Muto, in a match where the winner is expected to get a shot at Tenryu's Triple Crown on June 8th at Budokan. Final round robin standings were 1. Tenryu 7-1-1 15 points and Kia 7-1-1 15 3. Kawada 7-2 14 4. Williams 6-2-1 13 and Barton 6-2-1 6. Yoshiaki Fujiwara 3-5-1 7 and Johnny Smith 3-5-1 7 8. George Hines 1-8-2, Jim Steele 1-8 and Mitsuya Nagai 1-8-2. Natsuko Ito, the 92-year-old mother of Motoko Baba, passed away on April 7 after a heart attack. April 4 in Minoa before a sellout 1,850 saw Williams pin Hines in 14:08 with a backdrop driver, Barton pinned Fujiwara with a diamond cutter and Kawada pinned Nagai after an Enzui-jiri in 11:50. April 7 in Osaka before a sellout of 1,800 saw Nagai beat Steele with an armbar, Williams go to a 30-minute draw with Barton. That must have been very scary to watch. Tenryu pinned Hines in 4:38 with a lariat and Kawada beat Kia via submission in 20:59 with the stretch plum. April 8 in Yokkaichi before a poor crowd of 1,050 saw Barton pin Smith after a powerbomb in 1901, Kia pinned Nagai in 16:15 with a Hawaiian crusher and Tenryu pinned Steele after a lariat in 4:45. Generally Tenryu's matches have been kept short, although he did to 30 with Kia, because of his bad neck. The Tenryu and Kim Duke tag team, which is challenging for the tag titles on April 14 against Smith and Kia, were once a mid-card tag team in the Carolinas back in the 70s. Masato Tanaka, Geto and Jado will likely work the June 8 Budokan Hall show. Pro Wrestling Noah. No surprises in the GHC tournament. The semifinals are Mitsuharu Misawa vs. Jun Akiyama on April 11 in Hiroshima and Vader vs. Yoshihiro Takayama on April 12, with the two winners meeting for the title on April 15 at the Ariake Coliseum in Tokyo in the company's second biggest show to date. Misawa pinned Ogawa on April 4 in Okayama with the Emerald Erosion in 1944 to advance into the Final Four. Vader, as expected, made the Final Four on April 6 in Kanazawa with a pin on Daisuke Ikeda after a choke slam. Akiyama, on April 8 in Tokyo at Differ Ariake, advanced with a quick win using the front guillotine submission on Takeshi Rikio in 4:02. Misawa and Ogawa, after shooting the angle on April 1 to build some heat for their April 4 match, were actually back as a tag team on April 6, the same night the angle itself aired on the first television show. New Japan. Lots of talk there will be a booking change after all. The belief is some of the wrestlers will form a booking committee to replace Riki Choshu, who has been head booker dating back to the early 90s and built the company to where it could run several dome shows per year. No question the lack of developing new charismatic talent, where have we heard this before, and an inability to come up with a new concept in an ever-changing marketplace have hurt New Japan, particularly over the past 15 months. Unfortunately, and Mark Madden actually pointed this out best, American wrestling largely revitalized itself stealing concepts from Japan. When Japan failed to come up with new concepts in recent years, it tried to steal them from the US, but that didn't work, and the US has nothing new to steal from Japan, which is why there haven't been new concepts of late. As another sign of declining business, the decision has been made during tours to try and limit bookings to 4 days per week, running a Thursday through Sunday schedule with Monday through Wednesday off since those dates are harder to draw. Antonio Inoki pretty well admitted this week that there would be no Mike Tyson match. Next tour is April 19th to May 2nd. Foreigners on the entire tour are Scott Hall, Scott Norton, Robbie Rage, Dr. Wagner Jr. and Silver King. Guests on the tour are Super Delphin and Takahiro Murahama of Osaka Pro on April 20th, Shinsei Shinzaki, as Keiji Muto's tag team partner, on April 21st and April 22nd, Taiyo Kia, as Muto's tag partner, from April 28th to May 2nd. Tatsumi Fujinami and Choshu each worked 2 dates on the tour, while Muto will work all the dates with Kia and Shinzaki as well as the April 19th singles match against Jushin Liger. Muto and Shinzaki face Fujinami and Osamu Nishimura on April 21st in Kasugai and face Hiro Saito and Masahiro Chono on April 22nd in Tsu. Muto and Kia face Hall and Chono on April 28th in Beppu, Tatsutoshi Goto and Hiroyoshi Tenzan on April 29th in Nagasaki, Yuji Nagata and Yutaka Yoshi on April 30th in Kagoshima and Satoshi Kojima and Michiyoshi Ohara on May 2nd in Tokuyama. None of the Japanese companies are willing to spend huge money to get the top US wrestlers that may become available. The top money they will spend is the level Hall is getting, which is believed to be $12,000 per week. After the Fukuoka Dome, the two major shows of the year will be July 20th at the Sapporo Dome and October 8th at the Tokyo Dome. The G1 Climax tournament will be 7 dates, with August 4th and August 5th at the Osaka Furitsu Gym, August 6th at Nagoya Aichi Gym, August 8th in Sendai and August 10th, August 11th and August 12th at Tokyo Sumo Hall. March 24th wasn't much of a show except for the opener. First match saw Minoru Tanaka beat Liger. Only the last 5 minutes of a 16:01 match aired. Very good match as you'd expect, particularly Tanaka looked awesome. Finishing spot saw Tanaka quickly move from a dragon suplex to a straight armbar to a cross armbar. People were into it. Muto and Don Frye beat Kojima and Tenzan in a non-title match. Again they only aired the last 5 minutes. Frye was moving slowly due to his messed up left hamstring and of course Muto can't do much standing because of his knees. Muto is pretty good on the mat and has charisma so he can get by on his name. Frye used Kojima's finisher, the Diamond Cutter, on him, then got a submission with an armbar. It was okay. Post-match saw all of Team 2000 pounding on Frye and Muto after the match until Hiroshi Hashi, in a suit and tie, made the save using the Uranage on Tenzan and Hall. Of course people popped real big seeing Hashi as a surprise on a New Japan show. TV main saw Norton win the IWGP Heavyweight title from Sasaki in 11:49. Pretty bad, maybe 1/2 stars, for a world title change. Not much at all and ending was sudden, just Norton ducking a lariat and coming back with a flying lariat on the comeback. People popped seeing the title change but except for WCW title matches in recent years, you'll be hard pressed to find a worse world title change match in recent history. Actually the TV main wasn't the title change, but Inoki. They showed Inoki's interview from the March 20th show at Yoyogi Gym where he brought out Yasuda, Fujita and Hashimoto in his divan, get the tables. Cadence. This wound up with Fujinami, Nakanishi and Sasaki all out there issuing challenges back. Very different to see a New Japan TV show built around an interview as opposed to a match. Very Americanized. And unfortunately New Japan's history over the past year has been when it gets Americanized, it usually doesn't do it well nor go over well with the crowd that still wants credibility in its product. March 31st TV show was pretty good because of the main event. Show had tons of Inoki interviews pushing the April 9th Osaka Dome show. It's just so weird to see the TV built around him again. Liger and Samurai beat Kashin and Tanaka in a pretty good opener. Tanaka did the greatest swinging DDT escape I've ever seen, basically right before impact, doing a nip-up and floating into a heel hook. Tanaka is the bomb in New Japan. Liger nearly killed Kashin when they had some problems doing a Liger bomb. Kind of like Undertaker losing the guys on the last ride spot except scarier. Liger ended up pinning Kashin after a brainbuster. The last 5 minutes aired. 3 1/4 stars. It had the feel of a match even better than that but so much was edited out. They did a great post-match angle with Murakami attacking Liger to set up Osaka Dome. It ended up as a pull-apart. Murakami totally gets it. He's a shoot fighter who is awesome in every pro wrestling angle, including ripping up Liger's mask. Sasaki pinned Nishimura with a bad-looking lariat. Not much heat but the match was decent until the finish. Nishimura looks too physically weak next to this blown-up Sasaki so it's a visual mismatch, but his moves like his missile dropkick and German suplexes were on the mark so it's technically a good match. Of course what kills it was that no matter what Nishimura did and how it looked, nobody bought he had a prayer to win. 1 1/2 stars. Iizuka and Nagata beat Muto and Frye in 16:36. Good mat wrestling. It's the only way Muto can still do it. Because Muto is such a big star, he can get away with it, plus Japanese fans are more accepting of shoot moves. All four are very good on the ground. Strange finish. Frye had the crossface on Nagata forever. Way too long before Iizuka made the save. Frye went after Iizuka who hit Frye with a dropkick and he staggered backwards into a back suplex by Nagata for the pin. 2 3/4 stars. Main was the Tenzan and Kojima IWGP Tag title defense over Choshu and Makabe in 9:39. A hell of a match. Tenzan and Kojima are technically in the ring the best tag team in the business, not as spectacular as Hardys but technically much better, and have tons of charisma. They really carried Choshu, making Choshu look the best he has in years even though all Choshu did was lariats all over the place. Tenzan just sold for Choshu to making him a god, which is what the fans want to see him as. Choshu and Makabe did the stuff piledriver on both guys, which was a throwback for longtime fans of the Choshu and Animal Hamaguchi days of the 80s and the crowd loved it. Crowd basically loved the whole match as Tenzan and Kojima sold so well. Choshu even did a top rope superplex at age 49 on Tenzan. Kojima blocked the 1000th Choshu lariat of the match and turned it into a Kojima cutter, then did another cutter for a great near fall. Big pop for Makabe's near fall on Kojima with a German suplex before Kojima stopped Makabe dead with, you guessed it, a lariat, for the pin. Between Choshu and Sasaki, that move had been seen so many times on one TV show it was amazing to see it as the finisher. 3 3/4 stars. They also aired 4 minutes of highlights of the March 2nd pay-per-view match with Misawa and Akiyama vs Nagata and Hashimoto. With the exception of one spot of Nagata kicking the hell out of Misawa, and the finish itself, it was done to build up Akiyama vs Nagata. Of course the two were excellent in what was shown. This was a match that came off much better edited because those two were so good than unedited. It's another pay-per-view main event where the best stuff airs on television, and I don't know about that being sound business for growing pay-per-view. Other Japan notes. Austin and Vince McMahon were on the cover as well as the lead story of the April 17th issue of Weekly Pro Wrestling regarding the WrestleMania turn and title switch. In more than 1,000 issues of the magazine, there have maybe been 3 or 4 covers based on something in the US. I remember an Austin cover when he was at his peak which was considered groundbreaking, and the Hoist Gracie vs. Ken Shamrock cover after their second match in 1995, and there may have been 1 or 2 others but the number is very few. Gia ran a big show on April 8th selling out the 3,600-seat Nagoya International Hall for a match where Crush Gals 2000 agreed to split up if they failed to beat AW Tag Champs Akira Hokuto and Mayumi Ozaki in a non-title match. As you can figure, Crush Gals won. This leads to April 22nd in Osaka with Crush Gals vs. Asia Kong and Kyoko Inoue, plus Ozaki and Hokuto, defending the tag titles against Sugar Sato and Chikeo Nagashima. Ozaki defends the singles title against Chigusa Nagayo on April 29th in Kawasaki, which also includes a Kyoko Inoue vs. Lioness Asuka singles match. Vampiro, who was one of the wrestlers fired this past week by WCW because the WWF had no interest in them, is attempting to get back into Mexico and has a tour scheduled starting May 19th for Toriuman in Japan. Urgent on April 21st in Kawasaki is running a major show for them, with Queen Aversion champ Ayako Hamada defending against Mariko Yoshida and Sky High Aversion champ Mika Akino defending against Lady Apache. Here and there. There was a nice obit for Raymond Gedeon, Red Shoes Dugan, in the West Side Weekly. Gedeon was born in Cleveland and moved to Santa Monica right after getting married in 1938. While working for an aircraft company, he started wrestling in a local gym, starting relatively old at 26. 2 years later, he joined the Santa Monica Police Department and moonlighted as a pro wrestler. The PD had a rule about officers moonlighting, so he became Johnny Red Shoes Dugan by night, a nickname he took supposedly after being given red wrestling boots as a gift while wrestling in Mexico City. Everyone knew, literally for nearly 3 decades, that Ray Gedeon and Red Shoes Dugan were the same, but since he was well liked, nobody ever said anything. He continued to wrestle and referee as well as do police work into the 60s. In 1970, he retired from the police force and became a full-time referee out of Los Angeles, and 2 years later when New Japan was formed he started refereeing there as well. He was friends with Sylvester Stallone, so he wound up playing the role as referee in both Rocky II and III. Riser Bowden, who handled the interviews and television ring announcing for Bill Watts Mid-South Wrestling in the early 80s, passed away on April 2nd after battling cancer for 1 year at the age of 74. Bowden worked at Channel 3 in Shreveport, where Watts in the old days had wrestlers go once a week to do interviews for every market on the circuit as well as tape television at the Irish McNeil Boys Club. The small gym hosted some of the greatest television wrestling shows of the late 70s and early 80s era with stars like Junkyard Dog, Ted DiBiase, Jim Duggan, The Midnight Express, Rock, and Roll Express, Steve Williams, Terry Taylor, Mr. Wrestling 2, Butch Reed, Magnum TA and so many others. When Bowden retired from the broadcasting business in 1985, Jim Ross started handling the interviews and Boyd Pierce was moved to ring announcer until Mid-South moved the tapings out of Shreveport. Bowden's local newspaper obit made no mention of his work in pro wrestling, concentrating on his exploits in the U.S. Navy in World War II, including personally witnessing the devastation of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The latest on Hogan is that he's still in negotiations with Universal regarding a possible Hulk Hogan restaurant and getting them to back a wrestling promotion. They've gone back and forth for months. Universal is expecting to finalize a decision yes or no within about 3 weeks. Fusion is still interested in getting into wrestling but doesn't seem to have a battle plan with no national television interest. Urban wrestling appears to be down for the count as people are falling behind in getting paid and they haven't taped new shows in a long time. There was recently a television pilot taping of a group called Pro Beach Wrestling in the Florida Keys with Mike Duke the Dumpster Dries as the booker and Cuban Assassin, with a ring on the beach. Chris Cruz handled the announcing. Bill Brown, who also has picked up the rights to the name Florida Championship Wrestling, is the promoter. Brian Blair's book Smartman Up, Say It Right was just released, $9.95. For ordering info you can go www.smartnoopnow.com. It's a softcover 96-page book covering wrestling lingo, explaining terms for new fans as well as how to talk carny, and a listing of wrestling schools and media outlets. Had a chance to see superstar Billy Graham's latest chapter of his autobiography. He's up to the 1973 era talking about his stay in the AWA. If you are a fan of pro wrestling in the 70s, when this book comes out, it's very good. Very honest portrayal of wrestling in that era. In particular the chapters about working for Roy Shire in San Francisco and Vern Gagne as well as his breaking in with Stu Hart in Calgary. Dusty Rhodes is talking about doing November pay-per-view show from Charlotte. That of course would require first getting enough television exposure to pull something like that off, and currently TCW has no television anywhere, let alone in the major markets. His next major show is May 5th in Dothan, Alabama, headlined by Barry Windham defending the TCW title against Tommy Dreamer, plus Scott Hall and Steve Corino appear. Roddy Piper is booked on shows on May 10th in Worley, Idaho, promoted by Matt Osborne, and May 11th in Eugene, Oregon at the University of Oregon, promoted by Portland Wrestling. Kurt Hennig is also booked on the May 10th show. David McLean, WOW, is attempting to put together a revived edition of WOW with new funding for syndication in September, and met with Vince Russo about writing the show. Jun Kasai of Big Japan Wrestling made a surprise appearance at the April 4th Combat Zone Wrestling show in Dover, Delaware, doing a run-in during the John Zandig vs. Tommy Dreamer main event, which ended up with a ton of wrestlers brawling with barbed wire, light bulbs and tables. Then on April 7th in Sewell, New Jersey, he did a dive at the top of the building, a reported 35 feet legit, through 2 tables, which may be the highest dive through tables in wrestling history. I don't even think Shane McMahon's fall into a crash pad at SummerSlam last year was 35 feet. It appeared to be about a 30-foot drop. Some interesting stuff on the Memphis TV show on April 7th. Lawler and Stacy weren't there live, but were on tape. Brandon Baxter, who does a really good job as a manager, came out with a Stacy blonde wig and Spellbinder came out with a Burger King crown. Spellbinder claimed to be Lawler and said he was a bum who had to travel all over the country taking any indie bookings he could to make a living because he was so dumb he quit the WWF for a woman like Stacy. Baxter, as Stacy, started nagging him about no longer being able to afford to buy her cars and jewelry. They then aired a tape of Lawler and Stacy doing basically the same thing. Stacy wore a skull cap to look bald and made fun of Baxter's face. Lawler wore a suit of fake muscles and started worrying about his muscles shrinking and panicked and said that he needed some more steroids. For the rest of the show, the crowd chanted steroids at Spellbinder. Burt Prentice has opened a new promotion in Nashville called USA Championship Wrestling and has the old WCW Worldwide time slot in the market. All the worldwide slots are up for grabs as WWF decided against keeping them and syndicating their own programming in the slots. They are already running shows around the area, and first big show in Nashville is April 21st. Right now the TV consists of old Prentice NW and Nashville tapes from the past. A promotion called Wrestling Zone drew 500 in Danbury, Connecticut on April 6th, advertising names like Sandman vs. Sabu, Chris Condito, Tammy Sitch, Missy Hyatt, Simon Diamond, Dawn Marie, Danny During, Roadkill, Nova, Bob Backlund, now 52, Balls Mahoney, Chris Chetty, the Baldies, and formerly Gorgeous George. Most appeared, but before the show, Condito, Sitch and Roadkill all posted on their respective websites that they were being advertised without being booked in the first place and wouldn't be appearing. They didn't appear, nor did George or Sabu. Sabu was advertised from the start but said not to have been contacted until the last week and never agreed to come. Sandman instead wrestled Mahoney in the main event. Show was said to have been terrible and a lot of people in the old ECW are real unhappy about it, feeling shows like this will kill the marketability of the ECW guys in the Northeast because fans will think they know-show their dates, especially since Sabu and Condito have a previous rep, which means if a promoter false advertises them, the public will put the heat on the performer. The same company is promoting a June 1st show in St. Louis with a barbed wire match, which will in almost all certainty be struck down by the Athletic Commission, and Jerry Lawler, Cat, Public Enemy, Sandman, Mahoney, Diamond, Dawn Marie, and Harris Twins. They held a fundraiser on April 7th in Schenectady, New York for the proposed Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame. Most of the leading political figures in the city were there for the unveiling of sketches for the museum and hall, patterned after the Boxing Hall of Fame. Among the wrestlers attending were Walter Kowalski, Jim Myers, George Steele, Gene Pettit, Cousin Luke, and former WCW referee Billy Silverman, who is from the area. Both WCW and ECW had offered support of the project, but I guess that just shows how much things change so quickly. WWF has not offered any support. The only actual physical Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame we know of is in Newton, Iowa, as part of the Wrestling Museum, which is primarily an amateur wrestling hall, and the pro wrestlers inducted were hand-picked by Lou Thez. It is called the Lou Thez/George Tragos Hall of Fame, Thez getting Tragos' name on it because Tragos was Thez's trainer, and are largely picked based on being great real wrestlers who were successful as pros. In other words, no Brunos, Flairs, or Hogans, which limits its scope in many ways. WWF and WCW each have Hall of Fame inductions, but they are so political that nobody takes them seriously. Ian Rotten, John Williams, has burned out as it pertains to IWA in Charlestown, Indiana, frustrated with the yo-yo of drawing 300 bringing in stars but then having to fight to draw 100 without them. He's turned the business end of the promotion over to Jim Fannin and the booking to Suicide Kid. He's going to start to work more outside the territory for Mid-American Wrestling in Wisconsin and a group out of Indianapolis. Ricky Steamboat, 48, worked for Chaotic Wrestling on April 6 in Revere, Massachusetts as a referee. Bruce Hart, 49, will do his first match in about a year on April 13 in Calgary against Principal Richard Pound for Stampede Wrestling. 1970s star Flying Fred Curry, who according to our records would be 58 years old, wrestled for the first time in years teaming with So Fred Curry 3 for Acid Pro Wrestling on April 8 in East Hartford, Connecticut. MMA. What would have been the biggest money show of the year in Japan, the proposed Rickson Gracie vs. Naoya Ogawa match, which TV Tokyo and Coliseum 2001 were attempting to put together for November 3 at the Tokyo Dome, has fallen through. Promoter Naoaki Yoshimura met with Kim Gracie, the wife and business manager of Rickson, and they couldn't come to money terms, and she also said Rickson, because of the recent death of their son, didn't want to fight this year. They kind of left it open they could do the match in the spring of 2002. Rickson turns 42 in November, so he's most likely only got one big fight left. Probably the biggest rumblings within the fight world are that a new company called Battle Management is forming and is signing up many of the biggest name fighters. Names said to have signed or being negotiated with include Randy Couture, Kevin Randleman, Mark Coleman, Maurice Smith, and Dan Henderson. The belief is this company is waiting until pay-per-view reopens and then they'll try and make a splash. Not much more to say about the US version of the Pride pay-per-view. I like the Trey Telegman vs. Igor Vovchankin match better with the American commentary. Actually, the stand-up matches always seem better on pay-per-view. Last two matches were good. The rest were either too quick, although Henderson Gracie was good for what it was, or too slow, Yasuda Sadake. The announcing of Steven Quadros wasn't very exciting. Boss Rutan has a personality but needs a more hyped-up play-by-play guy. They edited out almost all the pro wrestling angles, which was weird because the show ran so short, such as Mesjer Enson Inoue, which the crowd live popped huge for, and all the Antonio Inoki stuff, which, admittedly, would be hard to explain to an American crowd being that even the Japanese crowd didn't really understand what he was doing. Risa Stagmeyer did the backstage interviews and she was really bad. I don't know why so many sporting events feel the need to have a pretty woman handling the task which only makes interviews, which are so important, come off lame. It would be great if you have a pretty woman who can do the job. But this wasn't even close to the case. Once again, they did a poor job in getting over the size of the crowd or how big the show really was, except when they aired a very brief clip of the amazing business being done at the concession stand, but even then, you had a lobby shot of tons of kids wearing Sakuraba t-shirts, and unless you happened to know what a Sakuraba t-shirt was, you'd have no idea it was almost a 1999 Stone Cold scene. They mentioned the rule changes but didn't emphasize how strongly they changed the fight, or let anyone know Sakuraba went into the fight at less than 100%. They also don't announce return dates for American pay-per-view, which hurts them in building show-to-show business, although they probably don't have a date yet. Did a good job of pushing Sakuraba, Silva, and even Telegman Vovchankin as rematches for the future. Sakuraba was finally released from the hospital on April 8 after spending 2 weeks there after the Silva match. Nobuhiko Takada told the press that the doctors ruled Sakuraba had no eye or brain damage but that he was hospitalized with a bad flu that lingered from his pre-training. Because the flu was mentioned prominently by insiders before the fight, it's probably the truth, but the idea he was hospitalized for 2 weeks after the fight largely due to the flu as opposed to the beating he took sounds like a work. The Pride show aired on TV in Japan on March 31st in a 2:20 to 3:40 p.m. time slot and drew an 8.0 rating, which is a great rating for a Saturday afternoon. Pride has done bigger ratings in the past, but that was with main events involving Sakuraba against the Gracies, and while Silva to insiders was a far tougher opponent than any of the Gracies, his name had no mainstream appeal, and ratings are the classic judge of mainstream appeal. Some clarifications on last week's story about the rules in New Jersey. Neither kneeing or kicking a downed opponent is illegal, only kneeing or kicking a downed opponent in the head. On the issue of gloves, there won't be mandatory gloves made, but simply gloves anywhere from 4 ounces through 10 ounces will be legal. IFC wanted a 10-ounce glove, which makes it very difficult to do much grappling, and UFC wanted the lighter weight glove. The one point UFC did lose on was the elimination of shoes of any kind, which will work against the wrestlers getting traction to shoot. A few other minor changes. Punching to the back of the head is no longer legal, which is an offshoot of the illegal rabbit punch in boxing. Elbows performed in an up and down motion, the Dusty Rhodes bionic elbow to the head, face or back of the head or even the body, are illegal, but elbows thrown horizontally are legal. Bobby Hoffman failed a drug test at the last UFC, so he was suspended for 90 days, and his match with Mark Robinson has been officially ruled a no contest by the UFC and the Jersey Commission. Semi Schultz, the 6'11" king of Pancrase, will make his UFC debut on the May 4th pay-per-view facing Pete Williams. The rest of the pay-per-view is now officially announced as Randy Couture vs. Pedro Rizzo for the heavyweight title, Pat Miletic vs. Carlos Newton for the 170-pound belt, Olympic gold medalist Matt Lindland vs. Jiu-Jitsu expert Ricardo Almeida, Matt Serra vs. Shoni Carter, and Kevin Randleman vs. Chuck Liddell. The two dark matches are BJ Penn, the first American to win a world championship in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, versus Joey Gilbert, a former NCAA wrestling champion, and Tony D'Souza versus Steve Berger. They will add the 185-pound division and create the first champion most likely on June 29. Enzo Gracie was offered a title shot at Miletic but turned it down. As a natural 172-pounder, he's always fought bigger men, and not always with the best results of late, and with a skill level evolving, the idea he wants to fight 199-pounders just isn't smart anymore, but that's still how he sees himself. Miletic himself is a natural 190-pounder who pulls weight to hit 169 and usually gets into the cage at close to 185. One of the real keys to watch for the future of UFC is how the New York media reacts in the last 2 weeks of June. With the show on June 29th at the Continental Airlines Arena in East Rutherford, New Jersey, right outside of New York, the media reaction is really going to be the big story, and will magnify greatly if anything bad happens during the show. It was the New York Times, when the now-defunct Extreme Fighting Championships planned a show in New York, that wrote so many negative articles and a negative editorial against the politicians that passed a bill to legalize it in New York, which so embarrassed the State House that they reversed their voting position and voted to ban the sport in New York, a ban that still exists today. The test is a double. If the media ignores it completely, that may be good, but may be bad, in that they may draw a poor crowd. If they cover it and look at it positively, which probably isn't going to happen, it would be a major step forward to getting back on cable. If they rip on it again, it may be a major step backwards. UFC has changed the name of its May 4th pay-per-view from Fully Loaded, which is the name of the July 22nd WWF pay-per-view, to Locked and Loaded. The biggest submission tournament in the world takes place from April 11th through April 13th, the annual Abu Dhabi Invitational in the United Arab Emirates. With very little publicity, K1 returns to the United States on May 5th in Las Vegas at the Mirage Hotel with an 8-man heavyweight tournament, winner getting a slot at the K1 World Grand Prix in Japan later this year. This won't air on pay-per-view because K1 bombed out on pay-per-view in the United States a few years ago. It was funny because K1 took out a quarter-page ad in the April 8th San Jose Mercury Sports section, and San Jose is probably 500 to 600 miles away from Vegas. Probably because San Jose is the hottest city as far as kickboxing drawing in, as the big Strike Force promotion shows routinely draw 4,000 people at high ticket prices several times per year, but a lot of that is the drawing power of Kung Lo of San Jose. Here's the funny thing. Lo is advertised in Vegas as being on the show, but his name was never mentioned in the San Jose ad, and in San Jose, by far, his name would mean more than any of the names mentioned. The ad also never mentioned it was kickboxing, just called K1 the new fighting sport and reads something like 8 men enter, only one leaves, which makes it sound like some sort of cross between UFC and a pro wrestling battle royal. The names in the tournament are Maurice Smith, the biggest name, therefore his name also wasn't in the ad, Pedro Fernandez, Jean-Claude Luer, Gunter Singer, Paul Lalonde, Tomasz Kucharczewski, Jeff Rufus, and Michael McDonald. The March 17 K1 show in Yokohama was pretty strong. Main event, which only went one round, was very exciting with Mike Bernardo getting pounded early and coming back on 6-5, 273-pound blown-up Jerome LeBanner. Next K1 big show is April 29 at Osaka Castle Hall, which will be an 8-man tournament for a slot in the December 8 Tokyo Dome Final Grand Prix. Among those in the tournament are LeBanner, the favorite, Great Kusatsu Jr., Cyril Abidi, and Ray Sefo. Frank Shamrock will promoting his second Bushido show on April 21 in Phoenix at the Ice House. King of the Cage is running on April 29 in Williams, California at the Calusa Casino just outside of Sacramento. Tank Abbott, who isn't under consideration for the WWF but who had a no-cut contract with WCW, is now looking to return to MMA for a gimmick match and actually contacted longtime friend and former UFC promoter Bob Marowitz about putting together a match against Mike Tyson. Don't hold your breath waiting for that one to happen. WWF. The suspension announced on SmackDown for Rock is at this point figured into being a storyline reason for him not being around to both spend more time working on acting lessons and filming the movie Scorpion King much of the summer, which is his big film break. If buy rates fall, it works something out to get him back for pay-per-view shows, but that isn't the plan right now for him to be around until July or August. It appeared from watching Raw and then SmackDown that the Raw plan was to injure him, with the 3-on-1 pounding with the sledgehammer. But for whatever reason, they broke from what a wrestling promotion would do and changed it to a suspension. The suspension begets the question of why Linda McMahon wouldn't overturn the unjust suspension, a question which an injury angle would cover. The May 9th first WCW taping in Trenton, New Jersey has been postponed and the first taping now looks to be on June 9th at a site yet to be determined for an air date that evening on a 3-hour tape delay, although that date is also tentative. If not, the first taping would be June 13th in Fairfax, Virginia for a June 16th show. As the XFL showed, especially in a bad time slot, it is very important to be ready with all guns loaded for a first show, then rush things out to meet a deadline, and have a first show that doesn't hit big. This entire WCW operation is very much a work in progress as a roster hasn't been established, there is no front office, referee crew, announcers, agents or anything, and we're only a few weeks away from May 9th. Tentative plans are for the first pay-per-view show to be in September, although I wouldn't target a date at this point because nobody knows how quickly it'll become viable, especially since the plan for now is to fill the roster slots with WWF guys that aren't major players in the WWF as opposed to big stars like Rock or Triple H jumping, and house shows maybe in the fall. It's easier to gauge when to start touring as opposed to pay-per-view, when they are filling the buildings for the TV tapings, or at least able to sell a decent amount of tickets. That's a sign the product is strong enough for touring. At this point there are still only the 24 wrestlers whose contracts that were purchased on the roster, which would be filled up with WWF guys not getting a push, perhaps some developmental guys, and some ECW wrestlers that either haven't been signed or haven't started up. There have been meetings over the past week and preliminary plans formed, but the real decisions are just starting to be made, such as talent decisions. The wrestlers under contract will probably be brought in for meetings in about 2 weeks. The first course of business will be to set up a front office staff, which they are targeting over the next 2 weeks, and perhaps over the next week some people will be interviewed about working in key front office positions. After that, they'll start evaluating talent. There has been communication with Goldberg, Flair, DDP and Scott Steiner, but nothing close to happening. Goldberg and Flair coming in seem unlikely, Goldberg more than Flair, and Page is considered on the fence. There have been stories stemming from a radio interview about Flair starting an indie group in the Carolinas. Here's the situation. If Flair takes a buyout, he'll go to WWF. If he doesn't take a buyout, he can't work indies. As far as being involved in an indie, that all depends on the legal situation of what he can and can't do while still collecting his due money for the next 2 years. David Crockett, who has been in the wrestling business his entire life and who isn't being hired by WWF, is trying to round up investors to start something in the Carolinas. Flair could be involved in that in some form if he can still maintain his Time Warner deal, but everything is iffy. The feeling at this point seems to be that Steiner has played his cards right. They know he wants to come. He worked hurt and put Booker over clean on the final Nitro with no problem, so it appears better than 50% now. They'll seriously negotiate. but they still may not come to money terms. If Sting were to accept a Time Warner contract buyout, which is unlikely, they would consider taking him, as they would Flair and Page, although there seems to be a feeling Sting isn't going to do so. Same for Goldberg. Even though there are reservations about Goldberg in some ways, there is also the recognition that this feud is going to draw money. Goldberg is the key because it's the matches with him against Austin and to a lesser extent Rock that the public wants to see. Again, it appears unlikely right now he'll accept a buyout, but everything is up in the air until Time Warner makes decisions on what they will offer these guys. Then, at that point, WWF has to decide what kind of offers they will make. There doesn't appear to be interest in the other so-called top guys except Booker T, who everyone seems to feel is the closest to a sure thing of eventually coming in. There are no new guys signed because nobody has yet been officially offered a buyout by Time Warner to even accept it and start negotiations with WWF yet. Kevin Dunn is being put in charge of hiring the production crew, the television writers. There will likely be 3 writers hired, and the television announcers. Jim Ross will be in charge of selection of talent, as well as the agents and referees. They have tentative taping dates booked on June 13th as well as June 20th at the Jacksonville Coliseum and June 27th in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania for WCW tapings, all mid-sized buildings. David Flair was given a verbal, but not official word that they would give him a developmental contract and send him to either OVW or MCW. Because WWFE owns the name World Championship Wrestling, Turner Broadcasting has opened up a company called Universal Wrestling Corporation Incorporated, which is basically a front company to take in whatever money is still owed, pay contracts still outstanding, and do whatever business needs to be taken care of in settling all the various debts. The judge in the Sonny Wanu racial discrimination lawsuit ruled against Time Warner and Turner Broadcasting's motion to dismiss the suit. The lawsuit is going to look a lot stronger because there are many front office employees who have knowledge that can be framed to help the lawsuit who either wouldn't have talked previously because they were still working for the company, or maybe didn't even believe the lawsuit was fair. However, employees, probably justifiably, in most cases left the company very bitter about being kept in the dark about their jobs, lied to about the company's future in the sale, and would be far more receptive to helping stick it to the company now. Wrestlers still under contract to Time Warner and now UWC have been told point blank that if they work any dates, they will immediately be fired as a contract breach. Needless to say, a lot of the wrestlers are grumbling about that one, feeling that the company misled them in contract negotiations over the last year, claiming that restructured contracts lowering the guarantee and making it up with additional money per house show when the company had already decided to nix the house show schedule. And now for the large group not picked up by WWF, they are holding back them getting their careers going elsewhere. The people who had contracts in WCW that weren't wrestlers actually aren't bad off. For instance, Jimmy Hart is under contract to Time Warner through March 11, 2002, but is free to work on other projects including do indie shows and maybe even work for WWF and double dip because office contracts for non-wrestlers were written differently than wrestler contracts. There may only be a few employees in the same situation as Hart, but we do know that Gene Okerlund and Arn Anderson are also under similar deals. Flair is close to or already has signed a contract with a book company for an autobiography, which will be partially ghost-written by Mark Madden. Next year's WrestleMania is tentatively scheduled for either March 31st at Tropicana Field in St. Petersburg, the retractable dome home of the Tampa Bay Devil Rays. There are other cities also under consideration, and at best this can be considered preliminary because they haven't even done a site survey or anything. Current plans for the Backlash pay-per-view on April 29th in Chicago are Austin and Triple H vs. Undertaker and Kane, likely to build for Austin vs. Undertaker and Triple H vs. Kane for May 20th Judgment Day in Sacramento. Not sure if they'll then go with Austin vs. Triple H for the summer and Austin vs. Rock for SummerSlam, but that seems to be a timeline at this point that makes sense. Nothing else is locked up on this next pay-per-view, although Benoit and Jericho vs. Regal and Angle in tentative, and the Three Dudleys vs. X Factor is certainly appearing to be a TV direction. The Fleet Center on April 9th was booked for a middle-aged soap opera, billed as Raw is War. Last week we could blame it on a letdown after the Mania show. This week it's clear just how much the lack of competition and pressure is making things coast. With Rock out of the picture, one would think this is the time to push new top guys. And it was. But who thought the new top babyfaces would end up being Linda McMahon and Jim Ross? The show opened with the top babyface in the company, Ross, arriving all made up like he'd been in a boxing match with cuts and bruises all over his face. Vince met him and invited him in to watch a movie. It wasn't a bad home movie, but it was the same movie we just watched on Thursday. Angle challenged any champion to a title match, specifically mentioning Austin and Triple H, which guaranteed it would be either Kane or Crash Holly. Kane's music played, setting a Japanese flag on fire. There is a changing of the guard as this was the night Big Show got paid back for not getting down to 400 pounds. Match went 3:54 with Show and Undertaker both involved, making it a four-way, and Show taking a double choke slam from the alleged Brothers of Destruction, and Kane pinned him. Show then challenged Undertaker to a singles match. Bad idea. An uncomfortable Junior and Vince as Satan were on the couch when Vince brought in Austin to watch the movie with them. Austin quoted a spoof on a line from Deliverance, so I was afraid the two were going to rape Junior right then and there, except I remembered, there is no portrayal of rape on WWF broadcasts. Instead they aired the entire segment with Austin and Junior from SmackDown, which was great the first time. The second time it was an excuse to leave the room and make a sandwich, eat the sandwich, and actually start missing all those horrible Luger matches on Nitro. They showed a different camera angle of Junior's blade job. In one very brief camera shot, blood was spurting out of his forehead, almost like an Eric Kula's deal. I guess that was new and pretty sick. Ross said he could sue Vince, but he isn't that type of a guy. I was waiting for Lawler to say, well, what type of a guy are you? Reference to a 1982 episode of the David Letterman Show when Kaufman threatened to sue Lawler, except he said he isn't that type of a guy. Instead, Junior said he could quit and go to work for Shane in WCW. Vince sold that one with the old bitter beer face. Luckily, like with Linda, as mean as Vince is, and as nice as Shane is, everyone knows that WCW is going to lose at the end and you'd rather back a winner than a loser, so Ross didn't quit and instead did his job. Rhino beat Crash and Molly Holly in a handicap match in 128. The light heavyweight title means so much these days that you don't even acknowledge Crash has it, and he got gored immediately. Rhino set up Molly, who never tagged into the match, for another gore, but Bob made the save and beat him out of the ring. I've never understood the logic of when they put women in matches against men and the women take a move that's considered this horrible behavior by the heels. Shouldn't the heat be on the company for allowing women into matches where they are to physically oppose men in the first place, as opposed to the heel doing his move in the course of attempting to win a wrestling match he's booked in and doing his moves on a scheduled opponent? Vince had a bad feeling. 75 minutes into the show, so did I. The interviewed Spike. You knew that wouldn't last long. X Factor came out like schoolyard bullies. Spike tried to start a fight, but Albert basically threw him into the fence. The only thing worse than a babyface who isn't even competitive in a fight after doing a job for a woman the previous night is a babyface that starts the fight to begin with. When listing character traits that people like in modern babyfaces, not being competitive ranks just below stupidity and always getting outsmarted. Undertaker pinned Show in 133 with a modified powerbomb out of the corner. In other words, they wisely didn't try to have Taker actually do his finisher on Show. Show's constant losing at this point is a sign that right now, they have no plans for him to be a headliner. Linda came out for the highlight of the show, this lengthy interview where she ended up saying she wanted a divorce. Linda seemed nervous and she's not exactly the best actress in the WWF on her best days. This segment went too long. Maybe Vince just is doing us all a favor. Without Nitro on Monday, somebody needs to provide the weekly comedy, so he decided to book a show as if it was Nitro. Dudley's and Spike beat X Factor in 409 when Devon pinned Credible after the 3D. Spike took the sickest cracking of the spine courtesy of Albert into the post. After the match, Albert threw him out of the ring. There was a funny line when they did the "was up" on X-Pac after the match and Ross said, he shouldn't reproduce anyway. Albert gave Bubba the Baldo bomb through a table, and the Dudleys were left laying. Then it came time for a can't-miss segment since they put Benoit versus Jericho. Unfortunately, they were only given 3:30, since we had to leave enough time for the RTC. Regal was ref and refused to count pins. Regal wanted them to brawl, but the two hated enemies didn't want to. So they both attacked Regal, putting on both the walls and crossface on him at the same time. They did this great video package and a long plug for that company they own that just lost $80 million. No, not WCW. The XFL. Ross plugged the playoffs and how much fun he had working with Dick Butkus and tried to get fans to watch the playoffs. He didn't even promote they were changing the rules again this week. RTC tried to recruit Raven. That didn't work, so they had a match where Venus pinned Raven in 143 with liberal interference from the rest of RTC. Tried to make Raven a face as he kicked out a few times, but his wrestling looks noticeably ghetto next to almost everyone else on the roster. Hardys and Lita beat Austin and Triple H and Stephanie in 6:58. This started as Lita was telling Linda how proud she was of her standing up to Vince. Unfortunately for her, Vince heard this and ordered the six-man. Matt wasn't happy about it, but Jeff, in his first speaking role in a long time, was thrilled about their chance at the big time. This was the best stuff on the show, particularly Austin and Triple H did a great job selling for the Hardys early. It reminded me of a Rock and Roll Express vs. Ric Flair and Arn Anderson series in some ways, but not as good. Austin and Triple H had the Hardys beat up outside the ring, but Lita pinned Stephanie after a moonsault. They weren't the legal people, but you missed them saying early on this was under Lucha rules and the women were the captains of the team. Triple H then stomped the hell out of Lita and gave her a pedigree. Austin laid out both Hardys with chairs to the head and was pounding Matt to death on the ground with chair shots. Lita got up and covered Matt to protect him. Austin started killing her with chairs to the back and then driving the chairs into her stomach when she turned over. As a fan, I love this because the psychology and heat building was awesome, but from a business perspective, this was very dangerous after the unit case for a portrayal of Austin, who is still the most popular wrestler in the company in some ways, just beating the hell out of a woman half his size. Triple H gave Jeff a pedigree and Austin gave Lita a stunner at the show went off the air. Notes from the April 10th tapings for Heat and SmackDown in Philadelphia. Devon Storm, former WCW Crowbar, worked a dark match putting over Prototype. For Heat, Crash kept the light heavyweight belt over Grandmaster. Saturn beat Gunn with his fisherman suplex-like move named out of Dr. Seuss, explained later, with Malenko helping out and Devon beat X-Pac with interference from Bubba and Credible. SmackDown opened with Triple H and Austin doing an interview. Maybe edited because there were continuity mistakes talking about Foley being commissioner last month. Ripped on Hardys and Lita, which ended with Jeff hitting both with a chair and Stephanie slapping Jeff, but Jeff giving her the twist of fate. Albert pinned Spike. After the match the Dudleys did the was up spot, but X Factor left the Dudleys laying and Albert gave Spike the Baldo bomb through a table off the ramp. Regal scolds Jeff for putting his hands on a woman. Triple H demanded a match with Jeff for the title. Regal told Jeff it would be his only title shot. Show demands a match with Undertaker and Kane. Regal says Show has to find two partners. Crash does an interview but Rhino goes him. So the announced Edge and Christian tag title match against Hollies is cancelled due to the injury. Deborah apologizes to Junior, but then Austin comes in and yells at Junior, accusing him of trying to hit on Deborah. Chyna squashes Ivory and then DDTs Richards when he tries to interfere. Show tried to recruit APA and they call him fat and turn him down. In a 4-on-2, Edge and Christian and Angle and Regal beat Benoit and Jericho when Angle pinned Jericho with the Angle Slam. After the match, Benoit and Jericho knock Edge and Christian out of the ring, then Benoit puts Angle in the crossface and Jericho puts Regal in the walls and they both tap. Bob Holly vs. Rhino had no ending, nor any crowd heat. Rhino gores Bob and ref Jimmy Corderas. Molly runs in with a garbage can. Bob wants to chase after Rhino but Molly stops him and Bob and Molly argue. Show got Kaientai to be his partner. Show doesn't tell them who the opponents in the match are, so they agree. Taka's girlfriend from a month or so ago was back, acting as translator in all this. Kaientai makes fun of Show being fat. He makes fun of him being Chinese. They make fun of him being Mexican. Just kidding about the last one. Of course Undertaker and Kane kill them. Show walked out on his partners. Double last ride for the finish, although Kane screwed his up on Funaki the first time. XFL ad. Crowd chanted "We want Lawler." Test beat Venus. Raven dressed as an RTC guy kicked Richards. Test and Raven leave together and the RTC finally breaks up as they all fight each other. Goodfather fought with Richards while Venus fought with Buchanan. Jeff beat Triple H for the IC title in a good match when after a ref bump, Matt hits Triple H with a chair and Jeff does the swanton for the win. I don't think this title switch was planned far ahead of time, but seems to have been more of a decision made based on the reaction to the Hardys and strength of the Angle on Raw, with the feeling the reaction to the match and Angle in Boston showed they were ready for a big elevation. The original role for Michaels at Mania was going to be to interfere in the Triple H vs. Undertaker match at Mania, presumably to screw Triple H and lead to a singles match between the two of them. There is nothing official on Michaels. We're told his name is simply not a subject anyone is talking about in the company. Notes from the April 5th edition of SmackDown. A correction from our original report. It was Undertaker and Kane over Goodfather and Buchanan and Richards. They did the double choke slam spot on Goodfather and Buchanan, but the pin was a last ride by Undertaker on Richards. Overall, the first hour of the show dragged. Some of the second hour did as well. The Austin interview with Ross was tremendous. Austin was the star of the show with his performance out there. Ross' acting was great as well, almost teary-eyed at the huge babyface reception in Oklahoma City, which set the stage for everything. There were a lot of great subtleties, particularly Austin beginning to show a little remorse, but then turning violently on Ross. Ross did a major blade job. I think one of the reasons management, Ross, Vince, Shane, will do these blade jobs or crazy bumps is so that when they ask wrestlers to do so, it makes it so the wrestlers would feel like pussies saying no, when non-wrestlers have done it. The Benoit vs. Regal and Angle handicap match was about as good as you could get for a match with 2-on-1 and a 3 minutes match. Benoit at one point did 5 German suplexes in a row going back and forth on each guy. Angle is 18 months away from being the greatest performer in the business. Triple H vs. Jericho main event was a good match, but not on the level of most of the matches the two had last year. Something was missing, and I think it's that the fans don't see Jericho as a threat to the top guys anymore. Last year, he was the guy knocking on the door. This year, he's not viewed like that anymore. Some notes from the live Raw event in Boston. Most of the live feedback we got from Boston to the show was negative, with the expected complaints about all the interviews and in particular, replaying the entire Austin/Ross angle. While the angle was great on Thursday, most fans had seen it and it would have been more effective heavily edited. The Linda McMahon segment also went too long for the live audience, although it held the crowd's attention. There were a lot of boring chants during the first hour and some fights in the crowd during commercial breaks. After the show ended, and even after the angle with Lita, when Austin and Triple H drank beer for about 10 minutes after the show ended, estimates were that Austin was getting 40 to 60% cheers. Some reports listed the Lynn vs. American Dragon Dark match as the best wrestling match on the card. Low-Key, who worked a jacked match in a tag against Malenko and Saturn, also got some good reviews. Crowd sort of cared about Prototype in a dark match, but that was more because he was announced as being from Massachusetts, which is legit. A funny incident is that Funaki left his flag on stage after their TV squash loss. When Kane came out for his match with Angle on Raw, the flag went on fire off camera and it took an estimated 2 minutes before a crew member came to the stage to extinguish the flame. Skipper did a radio interview, noting that Kid Romeo was also on the list of those who WWF bought the contracts of. He said his favorite opponent was Kidman because Kidman told him he had no problem putting him over, while most of the more established guys in WCW had a problem with that. He grew up in Long Island and probably had never even been to Canada before adopting the gimmick. Before wrestling, he once ran a McDonald's in Baldwin, New York. The latest plans at this point seem to be to do nothing in storyline form using the ECW name. The XFL has changed the rules for the playoffs as it pertains to extra points, and the manner of doing so is going to kill any chance the league has of anyone taking it seriously if there is a second season. The coach has an option after a touchdown to get the ball at the 1-yard line for a 1-point play, the 5-yard line for a 2-point play, or the 10-yard line for a 3-point play. These rules are only in effect for the games on April 14th and April 21st and will cement the league's reputation as a total Mickey Mouse league, probably for the next year if it even lasts that long. The last cry for help after McMahon did all his media appearances saying to fans and media to give us another chance, and those pathetic spiels on Raw and SmackDown telling people to inundate their local TV stations and newspapers for more XFL coverage. Not only did it not do any good, and it only had the chance to backfire. Checking with some local media types, they received zero response, showing the WWF's ability to mobilize its audience begins and ends with pro wrestling issues and presidential elections. Actually, it's probably strong on anything except football. Boxing and bodybuilding resulted in continued audience erosion every week. There is zero sign of upward momentum, and they've exhausted every trick in their arsenal to gain even the curiosity audience back. They've changed the name of the first XFL championship game from the big game at the end to the $1 million game, since players on the winning team will share in a $1 million purse, which is about $26,000 per player. Rush and Malloy in the New York Daily News in the gossip column reported that NBC has made the final decision regarding dropping the XFL after this season. It claims the decision will be announced after the season and quoted a well-placed insider as saying, "No question. The show is one of the biggest black eyes in NBC history." The source claims NBC made the decision, even though it has a 2-year contract with the WWF as partners in the league, saying they will go to court if they have to get out of televising the games next year. However, NBC President Bob Wright claimed the next day that they were committed for a second season. Seriously, the XFL can't do anything right even when they try. The San Francisco Demons offered to help build a locker room at Diablo Valley Junior College, where they practice, and are having problems even donating money to the school. The team put up a $50,000 deposit toward construction of a new building, which would cost $750,000, of which $500,000 would be paid by the XFL, and there goes the SummerSlam gate, and another $25,000 for scholarships for female athletes to use when they move on to a 4-year college. However, Faculty Senate VP Linda Barneson in the San Francisco Chronicle asked if the college's reputation is being tarred by renting facilities and accepting money from a league owned by Vince McMahon. Yes, it has come to this. Now the team has not officially offered plans to build the facility, so this hasn't become an issue at the primarily commuter campus. Barneson stated, "When you let the demons on campus, you get everything that comes with Vince McMahon." Other school officials disagree. Athletic Director Steve Ward noted that the campus has been cheerleader-free and the Demons players themselves are the utmost professionals. They practice and they leave and have been good role models for the students. Barneson, a teacher for the past 36 years, said because of the image question, she will ask officials to review its policy on renting the facilities to the XFL in the spring. If we have to take money from people who are representing these things, then what message are we sending to our students? WWF The Music Volume 5 fell to number 52 on the charts this past week with 30,771 sales. Johnny Ace informed many but not all of the group of wrestlers that were under contract to WCW that the WWF doesn't want that they were being terminated when their 90-day cycles are completed. Among the names on that list were Vampiro, Christopher Daniels, and Michael Modest. Most of the other names in limbo are still in limbo. At this point in the UK, Bravo, which aired Nitro, doesn't expect to be carrying wrestling any longer with no WCW. Sky, which airs all the WWF shows, said they have no interest in adding another wrestling show. Dwayne Johnson has been offered the lead role in the upcoming Duke Nukem movie, but the deal is still being reviewed by WWFE. There were no house shows over the weekend, nor will there be any next weekend due to Easter. They are running Wednesday in Tallahassee, Florida, and split crews on April 12th in Fort Myers and Pensacola. There will be an Angle vs. Benoit match on April 18th for Memphis Championship Wrestling in Jackson, Tennessee. Pete Rose was contacted about doing Wrestlemania. Not sure why he didn't. The idea for him was to hide in the crowd wearing a mask and hit the ring during Kane's match and hit him with a garbage can. There have been people noting the irony of the Triple H vs. Jericho title change, seeing it as another subtle way to make sure Jericho doesn't rise to the top during the interim with no Rock and before the Triple H turn on the face side. Undertaker and Kane are both, long-term, no threat to the number one face position because Undertaker is too old and needs a great opponent to have a good match. Although his name is so strong, he'd always be put on top at any point when they need him, and Kane has no interview ability and is too much a gimmick for a consistent push as the top face. The working idea is to build Angle vs. Benoit up for either an ankle lock versus crossface match, probably not until King of the Ring. Ohio Valley Wrestling ran its Bluegrass Brawl on April 4th at the Louisville Gardens. There was a really ominous reality about the industry that this show screamed loud and clear. The last OVW show at the Gardens drew a sellout 5,010 fans paying $72,166. By all accounts, it was a tremendous show. Austin, Kane, Hardys, Lita, Benoit, Jim Ross and Deborah were the stars of the show to be sure and were the reason for the sellout. Obviously Austin more than probably everyone else combined. But the idea, in theory, is you would bring in Austin, get a full house, have your own guys work really hard and put on a good show, and fans will get into the local guys. Not that everyone, or even half the crowd, would then come back, but it would popularize your product and increase your base. Instead, the opposite happened. This show drew about 150 fans paying $1,800. Speaking of traditions ending, the Louisville Gardens, which has probably housed more live pro wrestling events over the past 30 years than any arena in the world with the exception of Arena Coliseo and Arena Mexico, Korakuen Hall, and maybe the Dallas Sportatorium, will be closed up in a few months. They were doing 400 at the shows with a local crew last year that was far less experienced and without real television. They technically had TV, but it was a station so weak pretty much nobody saw it except the people in the WWF office monitoring the talent. Now they are on the UPN affiliate and have a weekly local audience. It doesn't matter the angles. If there is no major WWF talent, the local guys can work their tails off. People aren't going to come. The reality of this country right now is that there are very few wrestling fans that actually want to see the product live. 2 years ago there were tons. There are still tons of WWF fans that want to see WWF. They used to say that in the 80s when knocking opposition, but then it wasn't true. Buchanan, the only WWF wrestler on this show, isn't a draw. The attendance for the big show was less than for some of the TV tapings at Danny Davis's gym. They're going to bring in bigger names brought in for the next big show on June 27th. Buchanan, who worked as a babyface, the role he left the territory with when he joined WWF, even though he was wearing his RTC garb, put over Leviathan with a choke slam. Main event saw Flash win the OVW title in a three-way over champ Rico Constantino and former champ Nick Dinsmore. Flash now holds both the OVW Heavyweight and Hardcore titles. Shelton Benjamin and Brock Lesnar retained the OVW Southern Tag titles in a six-person match teaming with ref Robert Briscoe over Damien and Payne and Sin. The show also featured the pro wrestling debut of Eric Angle, the older brother of Kurt, teaming with former UFC fighter Ron Waterman to beat Mr. Black and Jerome Kroney. Apparently Waterman, who was definitely on the bubble as far as keeping his developmental deal, showing a lot of improvement. Randy Orton continues to show noticeable improvement even when watching him week to week. I'm pretty sure he's going to make it because he's only 20. The other guy, who has a long way to go but very much major improvement in the last 3 weeks, is Lesnar. In my opinion, rather than fill the roster with guys who are perceived as guys who couldn't make it to the top in WWF, and even guys like Snow and Malenko, who would provide great matches, would fit into that perception, in the WCW it may be better to bring in some guys from here and give them big pushes as newcomers, like WWF is good at doing, such as how they introduced Val Venus and Edge a few years back and unfortunately haven't been as good about doing things like that recently, making people want to see them for 4 to 6 weeks and making their debut a big deal. Constantino is ready right now and they should bring him in with a push because he's got personality as a heel, although he could probably use a manager for distraction purposes. So is Flash, although he may be better off in a tag team situation with the cruiserweights. But that's either good or bad. Good in that he fits in with so many of the guys the company has, but bad in that he's just like them and they've got enough guys for those slots already. Dinsmore is a very good worker but has to change some of his mannerisms because he'll come off as a low-rent Bagwell without the physique. Damaja, because he can cut a promo and looks to be 6'2" or 6'3", is almost ready. Sly Scraper has the total Bruiser Brody look, but has less charisma than John Noor. Why do I think the first one brought in is going to be Mark Henry? They also should get busy with Prototype, either sending him to OVW so he can get nightly ring time because he's got the Sting look, a better attitude than Sting at the same stage of his career, similar athletic ability and much better interviews. They should send him somewhere else, and if they don't want to hurt UPW, just have him come back every month for the UPW show and he may mean more as an outsider big star from somewhere else anyway. When he's ready, and he needs the nightly wrestling before he is going to be, debut him with a push in either promotion. The guy if I found called Hamo Bull started in OVW about 2 weeks ago. He looks so much like Rock it's ridiculous. Unless you see him you won't even believe it. More like Rock than if he had a twin. Same face, same hair, almost the exact same physique. The physique resemblance is actually quite freaky. Same eyebrow gimmick. Only difference is he's about 5'8". He does all the same moves, which is actually in that sense pretty bad because he comes off as a bad cartoon and a novelty act that will go sour in a hurry. They should also do something now with some of the WCW talent that needs ring time and mic experience instead of having them sit at home until June. They should send 3 to 4 guys to OVW and 3 to 4 guys to Memphis and shoot them into quick angles that require mic time. Maybe some of the guys who need help in the charisma, mic work and projection department, particularly O'Hare and Palumbo who everyone is so high on, can benefit from working a territory and doing weekly interviews on TV and angles like they do in OVW, so when they start the new show in June, they'll be able to carry the ball in those departments instead of simply be guys who look good but are lacking so much that it weakens the TV product. Jim Ross in his Ross Report this week said that Bradshaw would be given a serious singles push, which isn't good news for Farouk, who won't be given one. Ross also noted that Murray Happer, one of the Dupes, was released along with Just Joe and Jason Sensation, as reported here last week. He also stated that he doesn't expect to be back as an announcer next season with the XFL, but said the league would be back next season. Lynn was working dark matches at TV this week. At WrestleMania's Access, Lynn worked a few matches with Rios. Regal and Bradshaw will be sent to the UK to do advance work on May 2nd for the May 5th pay-per-view show in London. In a review of the pay-per-view industry for the January through March period, the 2 WWF pay-per-view shows, as expected, were the 2 largest grossing pay-per-view events of any kind. Pro wrestling, and this is largely WWF, although there was the final ECW show and the last 3 WCW shows that figured into this time frame, grossed $52.4 million, which was 84% of the total event pay-per-view revenue. This shows just how much leverage, with the end of ECW and WCW, that WWFE has in the pay-per-view world. WCW's January Sin show finished 4th overall, which shows how much of a one-person race it was, with the Evander Holyfield vs. John Ruiz fight finishing 3rd with only about 150,000 buys. Rumble ended up doing about 550,000 buys and No Way Out did numbers in that same ballpark. Final figures aren't official for that show. The Drew Carey pay-per-view, which was heavily pushed during the Rumble, ended up doing 48,000 buys. Reader Joe Morrison did a table with the adjusted for inflation in 2001 list of the biggest WrestleManias ever. Under that category, WrestleMania 6 at Sky Dome, which would be $4.6 million in 2001 dollars, would be the biggest gate ever in North America, with this year's Mania in second place and WrestleMania 3, $2.47 million adjusted for inflation, in third, followed by 5, 4 and next would be the Gotch Hockenschmidt match in 1911. $87,000 that year is worth about the same as $1.5 million today, and probably Stecker Caddick in 1920, which drew $80,000, WrestleMania 8, WrestleMania 15. Last year's Mania and Louis Londos from 1934, $96,000, and is worth about $1.2 million today. The moss-covered three-handled family credenza name for Saturn's DVD finisher is a name out of Dr. Seuss. Ratings in the UK for the week ending April 1st continued at a disappointing clip. Raw drew 220,000 viewers, barely half of its usual average. The final Nitro with the McMahon simulcast drew just 60,000 viewers. SmackDown did 250,000 viewers. These were all the shows building to Mania. Heat, which was the first show in the UK to air after Mania on Channel 4, drew 1.2 million viewers. SmackDown tapings on April 3rd in Oklahoma City drew a sellout 10,949, paying $287,021. Raw on April 9th at the Fleet Center in Boston drew a sellout 13,802, paying $437,790. Arena merchandise at the two events was $214,230 or $8.66 per head. The readers' pages. Vince on Costas. Vince McMahon was in rare form. The interview started very seriously about the XFL and the ratings, and Vince gave all sorts of excuses, mostly blaming the media, as to why the XFL is doing so poorly. Then once Costas started about the barking Trish Stratus angle, Vince started coming off extremely defensive. He had this wild look in his eyes and yelled at Costas several times, even telling him to shut his mouth so he could talk. I was laughing my ass off, not because of Vince, although he seemed in character, but because I could only imagine what Costas must be thinking. It got so heated that I honestly thought Vince was going to grab Costas and throw him across the room. It was one of the most animated interviews I've ever seen. First, props to Costas for keeping his cool through all this. Vince was very hostile, and I wouldn't have blamed him if he would have just cut the interview off. I always have thought Costas was a consummate professional, and I respect him even more for sticking to his guns. Second, props to McMahon for giving such a controversial interview. I've always heard he likes to do things his way. Last night really showed his true colors when he's not the one in control of the situation. I'm sure the stress of the XFL is taking its toll on him, but something tells me his extreme reactions to Costas' question are not out of the ordinary for him. Vince has given wrestling fans many great memories, and I still respect him as the greatest promoter since P.T. Barnum. I just wish he would stick to what he knows, and that's wrestling. Third, I really feel sorry for Stratus. I heard an interview with her on the Law, and she sounded like a genuinely nice girl who was very excited about finally getting a chance to be in the WWF. Little did she know she would be used as a pawn in Vince's silly game of revenge against the media for ruining his precious XFL. I heard Jeff Marek on your show talk about how naive Trish was going into this thing. All I can say is that I hope someone will get her out of this angle quick and on something where she can showcase her improved ring work. Shy Shoemaker. I have no idea in what way your feedback for Vince was diverse, because he has lost his mind. He was clearly rattled and upset. Costas didn't come off very well because he reached to draw comparisons in some of his points and totally lose me when he complained about crotch grabbing and pointing in that direction and yelling "suck it." They haven't done that in quite a while, as Vince pointed out. Neither guy came off well. It was entertaining in a perverse way. Vince looked like a child and Costas seemed like he was doing an interview that should have been done 2 years ago. But make no mistake about it, Vince will catch the brunt of the heat for his part in this ordeal. Mike Velazza. I've got to tell you, Vince came off terrible, like a bitter old man who made arguments defending the WWF and insulting Costas for not doing his homework when he himself was the one who was wrong. He said such things as, "We won't see guns or knives or rape or murder on WWF TV. And, if you follow the storyline, then the WWF does not degrade women because eventually they get their revenge." I'm sorry. I've seen 2 angles involving guns. There was an assumed drug-induced rape of Vince McMahon's own daughter. There was an attempted embalming. Not to mention numerous incidents of degradation of women without the strong babyface comeback. For the first time ever, I have been ashamed that I support this man's product. He has definitely gone off the deep end. John Sepulveda. It's difficult to be proud to be a wrestling fan when Vince McMahon appears on a credible talk show, like he did with Bob Costas, and makes a complete fool out of himself. Whatever valid points he made, and don't be fooled, because despite what he tries to tell you about there being no difference between his wrestling character and his real-life person, were overshadowed by his persistent panache for pomposity. Poor Costas had to conduct an interview with an individual, who when asked a question that wasn't to his liking, attempted at sidestep answering it with childlike abrasiveness and confrontational equivocation. Granted, Costas' questions regarding the WWF were marred by a few fallacious items, but there was still no need for the embarrassing manner in which McMahon conducted himself. The Trish Vince angle from a week ago was needless and witless, whether viewed in or out of context, and the vehement negative feedback you received to it last week is proof of that. Did he believe they would show clips of the fabulous Benoit vs. Guerrero or Rock vs. Angle matches? Of course they wouldn't, because Vince himself, when in the media, pushes the raunchy entertainment aspect of his product and doesn't try and get over his fake wrestling matches which exhibit athletic ability of the wrestlers on his roster. The publicity the WWF received in 1998-99 for their vulgar product will haunt them for years to come, whether warranted today or not. I have no problem with either violence or nudity, but the WWF product has such a negative stigma that angles like the straightest one should have been approached with more caution. I guess Vince believes this over-the-top performance conveys that he isn't going anywhere. The only thing Vince succeeded with on this show is giving Phil Mushnick more ammunition for a column and completely embarrassing me for being a wrestling fan. Nilton Fernandez. After watching the interview, I was completely turned off by McMahon. I'm a huge wrestling fan. I understand the business as it is today, but I can also completely understand the stigma the WWF has from the media and from the average American. The appearance of McMahon on the show completely overshadowed his many valid points. His intimidating over-the-top over-defensive demeanor and finger-pointing came off really bad and was completely uncivil. He made a very truthful statement to Costas after airing the dog barking segment that the show unfairly edited the segment without showing the grand scheme of the storyline. But, with his angered presentation and giving Costas a hard time during his questioning of the segment, it muted all his points. Anyone watching the interview must have had the image of Vince getting ready to attack Costas on live television. Costas did a very good job of giving the floor to McMahon and letting him get his points across, but Vince came off like he thought Costas was burying the product, which wasn't the impression I had. Costas stayed very calm, and even at one point grinned at McMahon's inflections and his wrestling promo actions when McMahon got in his face many times during the segment. McMahon did nothing to endear either of his products to the media. If he expects people to at the very least be respectable to the XFL or the WWF, he can't be a hot-headed over-the-top figure that he was. He has to show civility in a forum like this and give the media valid reasons not to trash his product. His attitude gives the media every reason to beat down his product. Is that fair? Not at all, but for Vince he can't spin it to say the media is bashing him and his product when he's spent so much time telling us whatever the media does or says doesn't matter to him. Donald Jackson. The first time I saw the show, I thought Vince crossed the line with his confrontational style toward Bob Costas. But after reviewing it a second time, I have to say that I came to a different conclusion. While Vince was certainly animated and defensive, I believe he did a great job. He was strong, confident, and to the point on all his arguments. I don't know if his style was perfect, especially toward the end, but he made statements that held weight. I'm a big fan of Costas and his show, but he was off base on a lot of his comments. The media in general does a poor job of assessing wrestling for what it is, a live-action live theater soap opera in a sports setting. The media has this very poor perception of what the wrestling business is, and they have a poor perception of those who follow the industry like you. They think not only is the wrestling product low rent, but so are we, the ones who follow the business passionately. Vince was merely defending his product and trying to shoot down poorly directed myths about wrestling. He had complete control of the interview and actually made some strong points about the XFL. I thought the first 20 minutes were solid on his part and a lot of what he said was true. I think Costas was taking a certain perception of wrestling and the XFL and putting them into use. You got the feeling he had no real opinion on the issues. That's not to say Costas didn't have valid points, but as I saw it, he was the voice of the media and Vince was getting his chance to answer his critics. I agree that the XFL's play has improved. I'm a big football fan, and when a new team is put together, it takes time for the players to pick up the offensive and defensive systems. It also takes time for a team to build chemistry within one another. I happen to be in the minority that enjoys the XFL. There is a lot of good young talent in the league. There have been a lot of changes since the early weeks, and I like the changes with the production features and the rules. The league has been a huge primetime ratings failure. What happened was the old saying, you don't get a second chance to make a first impression. I didn't expect it to succeed. Every other football league that has come along has failed. When Vince started this, I knew he and NBC were taking a big risk. So far, they've gotten no payoff and their patience is being tested. As far as the interview, I think Vince was at his best ever. He did a great job making his critics look foolish. Unfortunately though, even though his points were valid, the manner in which he used them didn't make him look too good. Mike Mitchell. I watched the interview with my fiancée. She couldn't understand why Vince McMahon was such an asshole. Being a WWF apologist, I came up with the best answer I could. I don't know. Where do you even start? We have fun with garbage cans and metal chairs, but no household items. What? No WWF fan has a chair or a garbage can in their house? Then, his reaction when Bob Costas brought up Owen Hart. What did McMahon do? He laughed, immediately, almost uncontrollably, like he would during an 80s cartoon match. The death is now a joke? And his response to if they would ever do anything like that? If for no other reason, out of deference to Owen, we wouldn't do it again. Listen to that. If for no other reason? Like if Owen had lived, it would be okay to endanger someone else's life. There were only 2 times you could see him not being absolutely ridiculous. The first was when he explained why the XFL was failing. The second was when Costas asked him if his WWF product poisoned the waters, and he paused for a second and said, possibly. Outside of that, for a guy who likes to fancy himself as having big grapefruits, he basically got up there, lied, manipulated the truth, and basically when Costas showed him the tape of him and Trish, he couldn't just admit that maybe he went too far and that pushing the envelope and sometimes going over the line is what made his product. He can't even admit mistakes when he knows he's made them. Instead of fessing up, he was out there vehemently defending himself with stupid defenses. If Bart Simpson does something bad at the beginning of the show, he usually gets his comeuppance later on the same show. Not McMahon. He humiliated her. And what was her comeback? He got her anyway. Wow, Vince, you always get yours. How anyone could see Costas being a heel in this interview is beyond comprehension. If he's guilty of anything, it's probably that he was a little ill-prepared. This Kool-Aid was just a little too bitter to swallow. John Segru. Owen Hart vs. Kurt Angle. After witnessing the spectacular first 2 years and all the well-deserved praise for Kurt Angle, I began to think of workers who became so good as quickly as Angle did. I've heard others discuss this topic, but one name is always left off the list to compare him with Owen Hart. Owen broke into pro wrestling in 1986 with Stampede Wrestling and set the world on fire. Stampede videotapes became a hot item because of him. I decided to break down Angle and Owen's first 2 years and to see who really was the quicker learner. 1. Interviews. This is a no-brainer. Angle is a natural. His delivery and timing is amazing. The content is solid, creative, and effective. Owen is similar to Dean Malenko. Off-camera he's really funny and he isn't shy at all, but he's soft-spoken. His interviews were the typical anytime, anywhere 70s and 80s babyface promos. Sometimes intense, but usually not. Outside of Mike Shaw, Brian Pillman, and perhaps Barry Orton, interviews lacked creativity in Alberta. Angle got to learn from Jim Cornette, Bruce Pritchard, and Vince McMahon directly and was surrounded by people like Rock, Steve Austin, and Mick Foley. Angle clearly had greater opportunity to learn from the elite that Owen didn't have. Angle clearly gets the nod, even though his mic skills in Memphis were average. 2. Ring work. Owen was a more spectacular worker. In the Observer ratings, he was number 3 in the world in 1987 and number 6 in 1988. He finished top 5 for Best Flyer, Most Outstanding, Best Technical Wrestler, and Hardest Worker. He did things which at the time were unheard of either ring. His matches during that time period were always great. Always. It didn't matter if he worked with Kerry Brown, Jerry Morrow, Carl Moffat, Great Gama, or Bastion Booger, none of whom were household names. Owen was not working with the elite workers of the business, with the only exception being Hiroshi Hazi, who was also just a rookie at the time, and they had matches that were off the charts. As a rookie, Owen had 3 stars to 4 stars matches every night, and was going 15 to 25 minutes most nights and sometimes 45 to 60 minutes. He did back-to-back 4 and 1/2 stars matches that went 45 minutes in tags against Hazi a few months into his career. Could Angle have done that at the same point? No chance. Angle has had some fantastic matches in his second year. His timing is incredible and he gets the nod when it comes to psychology. Again, Angle has learned from Pat Patterson, Gerald Briscoe and McMahon as well as learning from the best workers in the world. Owen had nobody of that caliber. His matches were 100% called inside the ring with little pre-planning to book or overbook the match to spice things up or take shortcuts. Owen's work is what made the match. Angle had great storylines to support his work. Owen had simple storylines, although they were effective at the time. Angle worked with the best workers in the business during his second year and had Jim Ross calling his matches. Owen had Ed Whalen calling his matches. To me, where Owen separates from Angle is this. If Owen, in his first or second year, had been given the push Angle got, would he have had great matches against Triple H, Austin Rock, etc.? Absolutely. Would Angle have had 3 stars to 4 stars matches against Makan Singh and Great Game for 20+ minutes every night in front of a few hundred people? I don't think so. He may have had good matches, but not great ones. As good as the matches Owen had with those people? No, not even close. I believe if Angle had been in Owen's shoes in 1987 and 1988 in Calgary, he would not have had as good matches. If Owen broke into the business in 1999 and worked 2000 in the WWF and been given the same push, he would have had at least as good matches and would have drawn good money. Would he have been a bigger draw than Angle? Hard to say, but likely not because of Angle's superior promos. Michael Lonsberg asked Angle 2 weeks ago, "What other honors or heights could you achieve after such a great year?" I can't think of anything greater than to say as a wrestler this early in his career that he is as good as Owen Hart. Trent Walters. China. In reading your note about China and the Forbes magazine list, I offer the following. The list is compiled using a celebrity index that searches the number of times the person is mentioned in the media. Thus, China had more media mentions than any other wrestler in TV, newspaper, magazine and wire service stories. Obviously, this list has nothing to do with wrestling, but about celebrity in general. Brad Smith. Sports Illustrated for Women. Response from Dave Meltzer: the list is pretty flawed in its approach if that's the case. If a second-string basketball player makes a lot of headlines for being involved in a lawsuit over 1 week, he'd get far more media mentions over the short term than Michael Jordan, but that doesn't make him a bigger celebrity than Jordan. Besides, with all the mainstream coverage of the XFL, there had to be far more media mentions in the past few weeks of Vince McMahon, Linda McMahon, Dickie Ebersol, Jesse Ventura and Jim Ross than China. Flair. The Ric Flair match on the last Nitro was a fitting end for him. Of course he did the job. He's old school. In the old days, a worker worked his way up one side of the card until he hit the top, and then worked his way down the card putting new people over. Not doing this is what killed WCW. Flair has been working his way down the card for the last 3 years. Who is to blame for this lack of willingness to help those next in line? Nash. Hogan. How about my hero, Bruno Sammartino? He never did the job to pass the torch to Hogan. He stayed around too long and bitched and moaned on the way out. Verne Gagne did the same. Maybe those guys are where it started? Maybe it's the money. In the 60s and 70s, guys were more willing to work their way down the card because they had no choice. They needed the money. Nash had no reason to job. He had the money and a contract that stated he'd get paid no matter what he did. Bruno was financially set. The sad part is these guys left very little for the next guys in line. When I went to college, my grandfather told me to study hard and leave there a better person. In exchange for the education, I owed it to the school and the town to leave it a little bit better than I found it. How many of the top wrestlers can claim they left the sport better than when they arrived? I know the guys who are left will now be more willing to job. They, like the wrestlers in the 60s and 70s, once again have no choice. Frank Delani. Response from Dave Meltzer: I think that's an unfair portrayal of Sammartino. He was never asked to put people over on the way out. He had a unique position and Vince Sr. always protected it because Bruno meant box office. He wanted to leave many times and they always asked him to come back. Him putting people over was never part of the equation because as long as he was around, they wanted to keep him strong. I'd agree on Gagne. Gagne would never put somebody over as the new Gagne. He owned the company and he used it to feed his ego at the end when he should have created a new Gagne and kept the top babyface position until he was 55 years old and the Hogan era began. Nash could have been fired for not doing what was asked, But nobody ever had the guts to confront him, and he was smart enough to know this business doesn't protect those who do the right thing for business. It's just a miracle of Flair's staying power and interview skill that they didn't kill him, because every booker tried dating back to 1988. There is a happy medium between the two. A generation of fans not only in the Southeast but in the entire country grew up idolizing Flair as the very best in the sport, and even though he'd often rise to the occasion, such as that last interview, he still did things that no legend should have ever been asked to do, let alone agree to do. Nash's fans aren't as fervent because to be a Nash fan, you can't be that appreciative of the game, but still, his fans will never see him humiliated, and there is no reason to humiliate a superstar, although he should have put new people over. Personally, I think a great argument can be made that Sammartino left the business a whole lot stronger than when he came, and that same argument, although it is not his fault, can't be said for Flair. Lawler. Your Jerry Lawler interview was the most BS from one person I've ever heard. The nerve of this asshole to send Vince a letter begging for a job. Just where Vince wants him. After all the comments he made on television in the 80s about Vince and the WWF, he has gotten a free ride until now. I wish you would have called him out on all this BS, Wayne Honky Tonk Man Ferris. I would think we have a winner for the worst move of the year, Jerry Lawler quitting the WWF because they did the inevitable by firing his wife. It had become increasingly obvious the WWF was running out of things for Stacey Carter to do, and considering after the current angle, there would have been nothing, she was released. The Ross report mentioned people were going to be cut. A woman without many wrestling skills was not likely to make the grade. Carter was in the WWF because she was dating Lawler. Without him, she would still be back in Memphis. If she had developed an attitude problem, that should have brought her back to reality. If that was just an excuse given to dump her, she and he should just deal with it. I understand his feelings in the matter, but considering how long Lawler has been in the business, he should have known better. At least he should have considered the timing of his actions, and just requested a leave so he could have assisted her in dealing with it. Granted, nobody missed him on XFL broadcasts, since he was horrible. He was the co-host of Raw and SmackDown, and had a hand in the Memphis territory. What makes things even worse is the appearance of Paul Heyman on Raw as a replacement for Lawler. Lawler had to know Heyman was talking to Vince about coming in. Heyman can do what Lawler does without behaving like he's never seen a woman before. Losing Lawler isn't a big loss. The WWF has lost Gorilla Monsoon, Jesse Ventura, Randy Savage, Roddy Piper, Bobby Heenan, Kurt Hennig, and everyone else who has sat in the broadcast booth since I started watching wrestling. The company will recover from this as well. It's bizarre to watch website polls that say otherwise. Bring back Heenan? Doubtful. He would be just as clueless in WWF as he was in WCW. Very doubtful, since he hosted the WOW show and embarrassed himself. Lawrence Evans. This is the Pro Wrestle Machine,